Open this hearing of the Senate Economics References Committee inquiry into not-for-profit entities, tax assessments. I note that the committee has formed a subcommittee for the purposes of conducting today's hearing with myself as chair. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. The committee will be conducting today's hearing via video conference, teleconference and in person. These are public proceedings being video streamed live via the Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. Witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. I remind committee members and witnesses who are appearing via video conference and who are not speaking to mute their microphones. I now welcome Australian Multicultural Action Network, Stonington Scottish Country Dancers and Agricultural Shows Australia. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you all. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today, beginning with the Australian Multicultural Action Network?
Yep. I'm Ravi Krishnamurthy from Australian Multicultural Action Network, and I'm the president of the association.
Thank you very much. And the Stonington Scottish Country Dancers? Mr. Stanley, I think you might be on mute.
Yes, good morning, Senators. I'm Graham Stanley and I'm the President of Stonington Scottish Country Dancers, and we're a branch within the Melbourne and District branch of the RSCDS in Scotland.
Great, thank you very much. And representatives of the Agricultural Shows Australia.
Good morning, I'm Jacqueline Wilson-Smith. I'm the Chair of Agricultural Shows Australia. Good morning, Senators.
Good morning, I'm Brooke Beales. I'm CEO of Ag Shows New South Wales.
And others participating on video conference, if they'd like to state their name and the capacity in which they're appearing.
Good morning, my name's Katie Stanley. I'm the Executive Officer of Ag Shows Australia.
Good morning, my name is Trevor Beckingham. I'm the General Manager of Queensland Ag Shows.
And Mrs. Taylor?
Hi, I'm Jessica Taylor. I'm the Secretary and Treasurer of the Barradine PAH Association.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much, and welcome to you all. We are in receipt of written submissions provided by each of you, but I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of any remarks, I'll invite members of the committee to begin with questions. Mr. Krishnamurthy, would you like to make an opening statement?
Yeah, so this is about what I've written, or? Oh, yeah. This is the first time we started doing the review return. Sorry, this new to me, the whole setup. So as I stated in my submission, the whole process is time-consuming to us. That's number one. And as far as our association is concerned, these are all run by the volunteers. We are non-paid members in the community. And most of our members are elders, and there are disabled community members as well within our network. And the treasurer mainly working in our association, they are not fully qualified chartered accountants or having any accountancy background. So getting a volunteer to join a not-for-profit association, that itself is very difficult these days, because we all have our own commitments and personal commitments, family matters and all that. And when the AGM is happening, and then we struggle to find members to join us as well as to join into the committee, as there are some administration works to be involved in this association work. So adding an extra activity as the self-review return and all that, I think this is adding a bit of pressure to us. I myself did it this year because it's the first year we started doing this, and I've gone through the whole process. We had a change of our public officer, so when I tried to do the return through online, I think there is a RAM, Relationship Access Manager portal or something, and where I tried to register, but there is a process to go through. You need to fill a paper form and then post it to the tax office, and then it takes about 20 days for them to get back, and then they said there is something which we didn't tick in the form. And the form came back to us. Then it took another 20 days for us to finish the whole process. Then it got changed, and then we had the authorities added to a couple of more committee members. And finally, we finished the whole work. We did do the self-review return this year, and we are up to date. But the process itself is taking a bit more time because, as you know, that a lot of these associations, we go through an annual general meeting, an annual election meeting every 12 months. And we have committee members constantly changing. So when there is a change of a public officer, then that needs to be registered with the, I think, Australian Business Register is the system. So the whole process taking a long time. That's number one. As far as the association is concerned, it's not adding any value to us personally because we don't generate a lot of money, and we are mainly registered to have an ABN. It's mainly for the purpose of getting the government grants so we can run the initiatives and our programs. I think the NFPs with the ABN are the only one need to do this self-review return, and there are a lot of not-for-profit organizations, small groups, they don't have an ABN. I don't think they are doing this self-review return, so there itself there is a bit of a discrepancy there. As I said, our ABN is mainly for us to deal with the government, and we get the grants and we run the programs and things like that. So basically, treasurers not having a full-fledged accounting background, a skill set, and doing a bit of voluntary work in their spare time, adding an extra task like this and going through the whole system is a little more burden for us. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mr Stanley, would you like to make an opening statement on behalf of the Scottish Country Dancers?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Well, the first I heard about all of this was when we received a letter from the ATO back in April telling us of new annual reporting requirements. What new requirements? We'd never had any contact from the Taxation Department before. But that letter went on to explain how we can comply with these new requirements. The letter included 6 different links into the ATO. And when you clicked on those links, you were really none the wiser. It just confused things more. We were not off to a good start. The first, we were required to self-assess to determine what category we fell into. Well, there are 8 different categories, one of them which was cultural. And if you've had a look at our statement of purposes, you'll see that we are a cultural organisation. But we don't qualify as a cultural organisation. The only things that qualified were in cultural were art, literature, music or musical purposes. And included in art is drama and ballet, as well as painting, architecture and sculpture. This is a very, very narrow definition. It doesn't include us, it doesn't include Irish, Greek, Italian, Indian, any other form of dancing. It doesn't even include, for example, First Nations corroborees. So, so the definition is far too narrow. The second thing that really disturbed us was I was required to connect my iGov ID to our group's ABN. Now, there's no way I am going to do that. My Gov ID is supposed to be a confidential thing, not to be shared with anyone else. And like many of you, you may well have already received many scam emails purporting to come from the ATO, but are coming from Russia, Turkey, other Middle Eastern and Eastern European countries. So really, I have no faith in that. The ATO claims that it needs my ID so it can communicate with us, but it already has our address and can mail things to us. That's how we first heard about it. In the second letter we received from the ATO on the 26th of July, it said that we can lodge our return through our tax agent. We don't have a tax agent. How many other small groups around Australia, and there's supposed to be 155,000 not-for-profit organisations, have a tax agent? Not only that, I've spoken to a number of tax agents and accountants, and they know nothing about these requirements. Clearly, the ATO is out of touch with the real world. In a report to the Institute of Company Directors, the ATO Assistant Commissioner, Jennifer Molstanani, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that name, is ruling out simplifying the new requirements. And she claims that the return should only take a few minutes to complete. There's not much more we can simplify, she told us. And this simply isn't the case. As the previous speaker said, there's an enormous amount of work for volunteer treasurers to comply with all these requirements. And yesterday I submitted a supplementary submission from one of our members and a colleague, Ross Gawler, Dr. Ross Gawler, who spelled out the problems of trying to work it out. As a previous speaker said, it's hard enough today to get people to take office in community organisations. These NFP tax requirements will make it nigh impossible. Because this tax is so complex to comply with, many organisations are simply ignoring it. One organisation I'm aware of even put a motion in their minutes to ignore it. This new tax also discriminates in that only some community groups comply who have an ABN are caught in this net. Only yesterday I heard of a large community group with an ABN and they know nothing about this tax. And of course it completely ignores those community groups who don't have an ABN. There are, as I said before, 155,000 not-for-profit community groups. Let's say each of them had an average of 25 members. That's 4.65 million individuals. I sometimes think that this whole process might have been dreamt up by the work experience student in the tax department. I think the whole process is a complete debacle and should be scrapped. And it certainly will cost the Labor government votes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And would a representative of the Agricultural Shows Australia like to make a short opening statement?
Thank you. ASA, Agricultural Shows Australia, represents 580 agricultural shows across the nation. And for hundreds of years, agricultural shows have been integral across rural, regional and remote communities to connect, unite diverse communities, to celebrate as well. In fact, agricultural shows have got a history of one of the most trusted non-for-profit organisations for over 100 years. Our recommendation through the submission is that the compliance burden is too much. It's actually threatening this very survival of agricultural shows when you look particularly at the smaller and to the medium-sized agricultural shows. If you look at it from a facts point of view, we're talking about 50,000 volunteers nationwide. Agricultural shows contribute over $1 billion to the national economy. And 44% of our shows are small to medium and micro. So just like our colleagues here today, likewise, our volunteers are under a lot of threat. So we have very specific practical solutions that are going to reduce the impact of the compliance burden, and they include establishing a threshold. So below that, the requirements would be removed. Increasing the deadlines for compliance, simplifying the reporting process as well as the reporting requirements, providing grants to really assist with the transition. We do acknowledge the purpose of the shift, but we're really talking about the transition issue is real. We'd like to see a boost to the capacity of the ATO and the ACNC for all the inquiries that will be coming from, definitely from agricultural shows, but clearly from other organisations in the non-for-profit sector too. And we're also recommending that there's better data sharing between the state bodies and the ACNC. So our submission is very practical. We're looking at how can we reduce the impact of the ATO requirements, because it's practically impacting the volunteers and it's diverting their attention from where the community purpose, and it's diverting that attention to compliance. And we're just saying that it's out of whack. It's too much too soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I noticed that we've got a number of witnesses from the Agricultural Shows Australia from a variety of states. Would any of them like to make brief supplementary opening statement to your remarks? Mrs. Stanley?
Yes, Senator.
Wilson-Smith, yep.
So, Senator, I think it's advantageous that you potentially hear from somebody who's on the ground, somebody like Jessica, who actually does two roles. So Jessica is both the Secretary and the Treasurer of Barradine Agricultural Show, which is a very tiny show near Coonabarabran. So I just think that, Jessica, you might be able to tell a real-life story of what it's like for you guys at the moment when you're trying to work out the process and how it's impacted you specifically.
Mrs. Taylor?
Righto.
Yep.
Well, so at the moment, we are just trying to apply for the charity status, which will then, set us up for this next process. And that in itself is very, very time consuming. It's very confusing, and you seem to go around in circles a lot. With that new charity status, we're going to have to adopt a new constitution, which will take time again, more time, more of my time. We're already struggling with getting volunteers to help, to be a part of it. I take on two roles. I've been these two roles for the last 3 years. And it gets tiring. You say you hold those two roles, but you also do a lot of other things as well. We haven't even got to the reporting stage yet, and I can't seem to get any information that's going to tell me what that involves. So right now we're self-reporting, which is quite easy for us. All our documentation throughout the year, we keep it in a folder, and then it's reconciled with our bank statements by an individual not associated with us and signed off as our audit, and we submit that to Fair Trading, and we're done. It's a simple process for us. So this whole start of it is just very, very overwhelming for us.
Great, thank you very much. We'll proceed to questions given the limited time, and I might begin with a general question to each of the witnesses. Can you explain to me what level of interaction you've had with the Australian Taxation Office when you've been raising queries around the implementation? Mr. Krishnamurthy? Yep.
Yeah, I received this letter on behalf of association through the post. That's the first time I saw this requirement from the Taxation Office. And our association registered in ACT is also part of CMCF, which is Canberra Multicultural Community Forum. CMCF finished this process first, I believe, in the whole of ACT. And they ran a presentation session with all member associations, and they just explained the whole process of what needs to happen with this one. So with the Taxation Office, I didn't speak to them directly, but through the CMCF, I learned the whole process, and it was pretty similar for everyone, the same review. Why do we need to do this? Because we are all small associations getting grant from the government and running some cultural programs and things like that. So So that's where this whole discussion happened between the associations, and then most of us, we felt the same. It's like, being a volunteer, running an association and adding an extra burden like this is going to take too much time for us. And it may even make no one to come forward to do the treasury work with any of these NFP associations. That's the main thing. Yeah. And can I also add one more point here, if it's okay? Please, yeah. We do lodge the annual tax returns with the local government, annual returns, not the tax return. In the ACT, we do the annual return. We run an AGM, and then we produce our audited financial report to all our members. And we file the annual return within 28 days to the ACT government here. So what is happening with these not-for-profit associations? It's already with the local government. I think that's what Jackie was mentioning before. So the information is already there in some form of documentation with the system. So if taxation office can somehow link their system to the local authorities and they can get the details, that may be the quickest option for us. We don't need to do any extra work. At the same time, tax office has got what they need to check and all that. And part of the annual return, we have 3 categories. One is a small association, medium, and large. And most of these associations we deal with, we all have less than $30,000 we deal in a year. So doing all this extra work, or as I think, what's his name, Mr. Stanley was saying, looking for a tax agent to do all this work, I think it's just too much. Yeah, that's it.
Mr. Stanley, can you share for the committee your experience with your association's interactions with the Australian Taxation Office? Or?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Look, there is a breakdown in communications. I really wonder whether the people in the Taxation Department fully understand the problems that they've created. I've been in touch with an officer from the Taxation Department, and both email and verbal. In each case where I've sent an email, all that's happened is I've been referred to one of those links, and already I've got a stack of paper like that of all the various links to this, that, and everything else, and all of it means nothing. But look, not only that, I have got that supplementary submission that you've got there from Dr. Gawler. Yes. He's the treasurer of another Scottish country dance group. He went through the exercise. He worked out that he had a tax liability of $89. So as required with this thing, he telephoned the appropriate number, got through, and when he got through, he was like, oh, no, you're a cultural organisation. You don't need to reply to this. So we've got verbal comment from someone in the tax department saying, no, you don't apply, you don't have to comply with this. And yet all the other things, the definition particularly, says that, yes, you do. So the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And so really, I think that the government should just scrap the whole thing. Look, none of us, and from the people I've heard today, we all do this, excuse me, not to work for the government, but to do it for enjoyment. Now, there are 6 great things about Scottish country dancing, and this final one is it's great fun. And that's what we do it for, to have fun, to mix with people, get some exercise, and all those types of things. We don't do it to have to work for the Taxation Department. Now, in my case, if we have to go through our records, separate our membership from those who are members and those who come to our socials who are other Scottish country dancers from other groups, we've got to separate them. Then we've got to divide up the expenses on that ratio of our members to non-members. We've got to do this for every function we have. We're not doing all of this to complete all these government regulations. So in my view, it just has to be scrapped.
So in summary, Mr. Stanley, you would point to the inconsistency of advice from the Australian Taxation Office, and you would speak to the sort of the regulatory overburden given the reporting requirement and then the proportionality of that to the size of your organisations.
Yes, we've got about 65 members. It is ridiculous. And when there's 155,000 not-for-profit organisations around the nation, I can see many of them getting all that correspondence and throwing it over their shoulder and getting on with life. They're ignoring it. Now, if you're going to do this, I believe that the government is going to collect very, very little taxation. It's going to have a huge increase in the bureaucracy to administer it, to go around all these 155,000 not-for-profit organisations to see if they're complying with the regulation and the legislation. And, you know, if you're dealing with some country shows, people in the country, what about, say, a country women's group that gets together to do embroidery and that type of thing? If they want to put on an exhibition in the local town hall, they've got to get an ABN number. Why? Completely useless. And I think the government is just so far out of touch that, as I said, scrap the whole thing.
Thank you very much, Mr Stanley. Would a representative of the Agricultural Shows Australia like to just comment on interactions with the Australian Taxation Office around the implementation arrangements?
I'd like to defer.
Yes, Senator. Yes, I think I might defer to Trevor Beckingham in this situation, who is a chartered accountant and has dealt with the ATO on a number of occasions.
Thank you. Mr Beckingham.
Thank you, Senator. Our initial investigations led us to dealing with Melinda Knight, who was the then acting director, not-for-profit integrity and guidance within the not-for-profit government and new messages small business section within the ATO. On her request, we submitted a number of constitutions, a variety of constitutions, which the ATO then reviewed. On their review, they determined that a blanket all agricultural show societies would be classified as having a charitable purpose. One of the concerns we expressed right from the out was the 8 categories. All of our shows could have fitted under any of those 8 categories. Having been determined that we all have a charitable purpose, we were then informed that the only avenue available for us was through ACNC registration. We were then put in touch with, and I unfortunately don't have the name of the person from the ACNC that we were dealing with, but they just then assumed it was fait accompli that because we were deemed to have a charitable purpose, there was no other avenue available for any of our shows to be other than ACNC registered. Now, by the ACN's own volition, it is a 2-hour registration process and there is a 40-minute annual compliance requirement that needs to be undertaken. I had one of my smaller shows, it's in Killarney in southern Queensland. They were struggling with the registration. They contacted me. I spent about 40 minutes with them. They, as a result, required to get additional support from a accounting firm, and they were quoted $400 to complete the registration. So we have had ongoing discussions with the ATO and the ACNC, but that is what has led to the recommendations that we make.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to make a comment from the various agricultural shows across the country? No. How, at a minimum, of what assistance would be a further extension of the reporting date to organisations like your own? I can see Ms. Wilson-Smith nodding in agreement. So at a minimum, how effective or important would be an extension to the reporting date, a further extension to the reporting date? Mr. Beckingham?
Senator, if I may, the extension would allow time, because most of the constitutions that our shows operate under, and I dare say for most not-for-profits, they don't currently meet ACNC registration requirements. As a result, they would have to change their constitution. The difficulty there is they not only have to have the changes dealt with for them, and in most cases that would be professionally done, they then need to convince their members for the need to change the constitution. As most of them only have minimal general meetings, it would then be in the AGM, and due to the time lag between AGMs, it's just a protracted process that will take time to deal with. So therefore, being able to extend the deadline would enable shows to be able to better, dare I say, market the changes to their membership, because most of their membership is going to be resistant to constitutional change.
Understand. Would any other representatives of Agricultural Shows Australia like to reflect on how beneficial and a further extension to the reporting date might be?
If I could add some additional comments, Senator. Show tradition is incredibly important. These organisations have been around for 150 years. Constitutional change for New South Wales shows happened 10 years ago, where the Department of Fair Trading asked shows to change the constitution. In the speed of doing that, in cookie cuttering into, hey, this is a best practice constitutional format you recommend, we had these beautiful paper-written documents that captured the heart of these show societies that were lost because it went to, this is a format that you should use according to this organisation. So constitutional change is not just swapping one to others, and as Trevor said, it's bringing the members on with a ride. It's helping them preserve the tradition and why they exist and how they remain at the heart of their rural areas. So I think that change can't be underestimated in what it's sort of needed to kind of bring that constitutional change to get to a place to be compliant. And there is certainly no resistance to compliance. Shows want to do the right things. Time's very helpful.
Mr. Krishnamurthy, how beneficial would be a further extension to the reporting date for your network?
We have finished already for this year. So I work in the IT systems as well. I work in federal agencies, so I know how the systems work, and I have digital access and everything. So I can do this, which is okay. But as I mentioned before, we run the AGM and the election meeting every year. So when we get the new treasurer, then the whole committee changes. As we have a lot of elderly people who are retired, I don't know how beneficial they'll find the whole process to go through. I think the last date now this year is 31st of March. Is that right?
Correct.
More extension, I don't think it's needed, but the whole process needs to be reviewed.
Yeah. Mr. Dorrington? Oh, sorry, Mr. Stanley.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think it would make any difference to us. We can meet the deadline of March, but it's going to be a lot of extra work for very little return all around. And as I said before, the whole process, I think, is wrong and should be scrapped.
Thank you. Just before I go to Senator Walsh for questions, just to Agricultural Shows Australia, I noticed in your submission that there was a suggestion that some of your organisations had not even received correspondence or advice from the Australian Taxation Office. Is that true, and can you provide any further information in support of that claim?
I'm going to defer to Katie Stanley on those facts.
Yeah, we have had some shows who are yet to receive any information from the ATO. I don't have a specific list, but they have called and said, we've seen it in your newsletter, but Barradine. They've seen the information coming through from us as a communication piece, but they have not physically received anything from the ATO. There's a number of other associations that are associated with agricultural shows, like a poultry association, that are, exhibit at a show, and those associations as well have mentioned that they have not received any information from the ATO as yet either.
Right. Okay, thank you. Senator Walsh.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you all for being there for us today, and thanks for sharing your experiences with the committee. Just a couple of questions from me. I'll start with Mr. Krishnamurti first, and thanks for your opening statement and for your submission on behalf of the Australian Multicultural Action Network as well. Just a threshold question. So I think everyone would agree that tax exemptions should be there to benefit not-for-profit organisations because they're doing good work, often with very limited resources. So there's a basic measure of support provided there. And this measure doesn't change whether organisations are tax exempt or not. It just changes the system, as I understand it, from a self-assurance model to one where there's now reporting required. And I'll come back to the reporting because I hear the evidence that you're giving, which is that people are finding the reporting taking a lot of time and resources. But before going into those issues, which I'll come to, I just wanted to ask as a threshold question if you're broadly supportive of the idea of having additional sort of oversight and accountability in the system, just to make sure that the system is fair and transparent.
I don't understand the question at all. Can you repeat it again?
So the question is at a threshold level, our tax systems need to have some sort of oversight and accountability. And we're moving from a self-reporting model here to an actual reporting model. So the question was just, do you at a threshold level, at a general level, support the idea of the transparency and accountability that's being set up?
Yes, but not in this format.
Way it's been done.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So the principle of it is okay, but the way in which it's being done is where you've got the challenge.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right.
Okay.
As I mentioned before, we do the annual returns already. That's happening for many years. So we are happy to report to the government, but not in all different forms, in different ways and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. The measure, obviously you've given evidence that I think people are just hearing about the measure relatively recently. It goes back to a review that was done about charities back in 2018. And then the previous government picked up the measure in 2021, 2022 in their budget. And now it's in place. And as the chair said before, there's a extension to the 31st of March 2025 to give people some time to sort of adapt to the new system. So I'll ask you a question, Mr. Krishnamurti, and then I'll ask the agricultural shows as well, and others who'd like to answer the question. Obviously, there's expected to be a significant adjustment in the first year. People are having to update their business register, as has been said. From next year, the ATO will be pre-filling the data that's already been put in this year. So I guess my question is, starting with Mr. Krishnamurti, do you think it might get easier next year? And what further help do you think would be useful next year for this sort of return?
From my understanding of the system, the public officer is the person registered in the ABR as the authority. As long as I continue in this association in my volunteering role, then rolling out from here to next year and the years after, I think that may be easier because, as you said, it's pre-filled. But when the committee is changing and the new people they take over, the process we need to go through is a lot there because there is a paper form. It's not an online portal. There is a paper form we need to fill it and then post it to the tax office, as I mentioned before to the first question from, I think, Mr. Dean. They came back to me after 4 weeks. Yeah, it's about 4 weeks, and taxation office, they said there is a tick which we didn't do. Yes, it's our fault. And I need to redo the whole paperwork and then send it to them. It took about another 3 to 4 weeks for us to get it back. So when the committee is changing, rolling over this data won't work because the new person won't have access. So he needs to do the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So that step, thank you for that. And that step of where you have to update the Australian Business Register and make sure that it's the right person who has the ABN number, that could have to happen again and again because of the nature of volunteering and turnover in volunteer organisations. Yeah. Thank you. I'll just ask the agricultural shows, Mrs. Stanley, it may be you want to answer, but you feel free to ask somebody else from your group. You said that I think broadly, in principle, you understand the idea of this, but it's more burdensome than you would like it to be. I guess the same question again. Do you think with the extended period that there has been put in place, with some of the phone resources that have been put in place, and the fact that next year the form will be pre-filled, do you think it would get easier over time? And what further help do you think would be useful from the ATO, thinking about doing this again, having done it, for this period?
Thanks, Senator. I think, as the other colleague just mentioned, one of our biggest challenges is the turnover of secretaries, which means also a turnover of public officers. That often somebody just drops the ball and walks out the door. And so when that happens, to try and make those changes to a public officer and pick up the pieces, that burden on those volunteers is enormous. Yes, I do think the extension of time we recognise why this is happening, but we are very worried of the impact that this will have on our very small, and a huge percentage of our agricultural shows around Australia are very small, under 5,000 people through the gate. They are not making a lot of money. In fact, they're barely breaking even. So I think the pre-filling of the data is fantastic if the person stays in the role. The challenge is the person doesn't stay in the role. And, that there lies a big administrative burden on them, and I worry of non-compliance.
Yeah. And can I just ask, thank you for that. Again, my understanding is that, when you're doing a self-assessment, you're sort of meant to have all of the information and make your own assessment, and now it's a process of, providing the information. Is there any change that you're aware of in how the information that was needed in the self-assessment it compares with what is needed now?
I'll let Trevor answer that question. He is at the forefront of it quite often.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you, Senator. One of the biggest challenges we have is that most of our people aren't technically qualified. The reports that they produce are general purpose financial reports, and therefore they're produced in a format that gives them the information that they require to report to their members in a most often easy format. They don't follow any standardised form, and it would be almost impossible to get a standardised reporting framework that would be able to be used by our shows or most other not-for-profits. The fact that most government departments require information in their format means that, and we touch on this in our submission, there is a plethora of ways in which information needs to be prepared and presented. Queensland Ag Shows is actually registered under the ACNC. I'm a CPA, FCPA by profession, and to do our return this year took me 2 hours simply because of the format and the way in which the required information needed to be presented. And I agree with the previous observation. The biggest challenge we faced is the volunteer churn, and this will only add to that. And as a result, pre-filling forms is great, but it's not going to solve the problem long term. The ATO already has in place a reduced reporting regime through the companies limited by guarantee, and our biggest concern is that small organisations are going to clog the system. If we've got 155,000 entities that are going to be put into a system that doesn't have the capacity to cope, by default, these small organisations are the ones that are going to need the most assistance, and therefore they're going to clog the system in trying to get the reporting right with the ATO or the ACNC, and therefore they're going to make it difficult for everybody.
And just finally, Chair, and just looking at the time, so just finally, Chair.
Excuse me, Senator Walsh. Mr Stanley, you might have missed it, but Mr Stanley, I think, put his hand up.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Look, just following on from Mr Beckingham's comments, we run a fairly simple accounting system, but we're now going to have to run 2 sets of books. One set to comply with our own requirements so that we know how much we've got and how much we haven't got, and the second one just to comply with the not-for-profit organisation requirements. Now, that's quite frankly is ridiculous. But I think in some ways we're missing the point here, because 155,000 not-for-profit organisations, many are not going to reply. I see, just counting around, there are only 6 people attending this hearing out of 155,000 not-for-profit groups. And I understand you've only received 17 submissions. Now, that tells me that there's a huge lack of communications, a really breakdown in communications. And of course, on top of that, we've got to also remember that there are probably many, many thousands of more small organisations like ours. I know in our own group, we have a number of Scottish country dance groups that don't have a not-for-profit, an ABN number, and not caught up in this. So they're exempt completely. So why are we discriminating against those people who require an ABN to comply with local government requirements to hire a hall or apply for a grant when other groups aren't even involved in the whole thing? I think that's one of the major disadvantages. But really, as I said, keep saying, the whole thing is flawed and should be scrapped. Extending the date won't do anything.
I think, Chair, in the interest of time, I'm happy not to ask my last question.
Okay, well, thank you, Senator Walsh. We are over time. I thank all witnesses for appearing today, and in particular for your written submissions, which will form the committee's, an important part of the committee's deliberations. The committee has agreed that responses to any questions that have been taken on notice should be provided to the committee secretariat by the close of business on Friday, the 25th of October 2024. Thank you very much again for your participation and your valuable evidence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, committee.
Thank you.
Have you been to a show recently?
Yes, the Perth Royal Show, actually.
Oh,
yes,
wonderful,
yes.
wonderful.
Big supporter of the Royals Agricultural
Am I
Society.
allowed to leave
Western
show
Australia.
bags for anyone to survive the break? Is that possible?
Of course.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you very much, witnesses again. I now welcome the Community Council of Australia, and I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Thank you, Senator. My name's David Crosby. I'm the CEO of the Community Council for Australia.
Thank you, Mr Crosby, for your participation. I now invite you to make a short opening statement if you desire, and at the conclusion of any remarks, I'll invite members of the committee to proceed to questions.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, committee. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am today, the Dharawal country, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge how much work we have to do in our country, not only to reconcile but to embrace an Indigenous culture that's been here for 60,000 years. I also want to acknowledge you, Senator Dean Smith, for ensuring that this hearing went ahead, and acknowledge Senator Nick McKeon, who also supported it, and other members of the References Committee. I think you've already heard this morning that this is a significant issue for many not-for-profits, and unfortunately not-for-profits are not powerful oil companies or pharmaceutical companies or others who have paid lobbyists constantly pushing forward their needs. In fact, they're often the quiet achievers in our community who do their work at a voluntary level to try and improve our communities. I also want to acknowledge the ATO. I think, as Senator Walsh was outlining, we all want a fair and equitable taxation system, and we support the role of the ATO. In fact, I must confess to being an employee of the ATO because I'm a member of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission Advisory Board, and I'm paid sitting fees by the ATO. And I also acknowledge Jennifer Moltisanti and Will, who will be appearing later. I think they've listened a great deal. I think Jennifer and I would have spent days literally in conversation about this issue. Unfortunately, listening is one thing, acting is another, and I think we're still facing a real mess as far as this measure goes. I also want to say, really picking up from what Senator Walsh said, that we think there is a need to better regulate charities and not-for-profits. And, you know, we're not arguing against a better level of accountability or transparency around those organisations. The question is, should the ATO be doing that in the first place? And it reminds me that a little over 10 years ago, the ATO used to be the regulator for charities in this country. There was no ACNC, and it was a mess. I mean, it was an absolute mess. If you worked in a small charity and wanted to claim a tax deduction, or even to hire the community hall, to prove that you were a charity, you had to show letters from the ATO stating your status. There was no annual return, and the capacity of the ATO to investigate complaints was incredibly limited. It's very rare that a sector like the charity sector would ever argue to create a regulator for itself. But if you've been regulated by the ATO, it becomes a very desirable outcome. And I think that's the case here again with not-for-profits. No one is suggesting that not-for-profits shouldn't have to keep some administrative records. And there is an argument for an annual return. The question is, why is the ATO doing it? And if the ATO is doing it because they're concerned about lost revenue, and you'd have to think that that is a factor. That's certainly a factor that's been suggested to me. And it's certainly a factor that might be important if you're going to justify all the additional resources that this measure is taking. There must be some kind of calculation somewhere that the ATO is going to make money through this process of increased accountability for not-for-profits. If it is going to make money, it's only going to make money from larger organisations. And when Senator Walsh talked about the 2018 independent panel review of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission recommendations, I would note that their major recommendation around not-for-profits was that not-for-profits above 5 million should be regulated by the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission. And I think we're still in that situation where that's what should happen. Large not-for-profits turning over significant income should have to do an annual return. CCA is not opposed to that position. There is a measure of accountability and transparency required. And it makes sense that it's the ACNC, because the ACNC actually have the systems and processes in place to properly engage with charities and not-for-profits. The ATO does incredible work and is a wonderful agency, and I think the work it's done to engage with people is exceptional. I actually used it as an example when talking about the role of the Fair Work Ombudsman recently. But what worries me is that this is not their core business. Ensuring that not-for-profits keep their records is not a role for the ATO, and particularly when there is no significant risk of lost revenue. So I would just reiterate the 5 key points that we made in our submission, that the policy was a carryover from a previous government. There was no regulatory impact statement around this policy because it was a budget measure. The Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission is clearly the most appropriate vehicle to collect information about charities and NFPs and to improve their governance and provide scope for investigations and making forced undertakings where organisations are struggling. The process for completing the returns is incredibly complex and demanding. I've tried to do it, and it's not easy. You know, as you've heard this morning, by the time you get through the Australian Business Register and the MyGov ID level 2 security to the form, it's a difficult process and it's time consuming, and you need lots of additional documents. The cost to this government, to implementing this measure to government, I don't know who did the calculations. I know from reading the submissions that there's 25 extra staff at the ACNC and still over a 3-month wait till they can assign people to a new charity assessment. And the impact across the not-for-profit sector is not just in terms of all the additional work. I think there's almost like a chill factor. No one likes getting a letter from the ATO, even I, and I'm employed by them and I get one fortnightly. And when you get that letter and then you think, oh, we're going to have to do something here. And then when you think the implications, if you get it wrong, if you're not a charity or if you haven't done your not-for-profit assessment right, you could face a retrospective tax bill for your small organisation. You know, to me, what we're doing is actually sending a chill across the not-for-profit sector. And I think it will impede people's willingness to belong. And worse than that, in my view, it will become a lawyer's and accountant's picnic. It already has to some degree. Even at my local tennis club, and I'm not a very good tennis player, but I'm a member of 2 tennis clubs, where the president of our local club is a very senior SES member of the public service. As soon as we got the letter, the response was, we'll have to take this to an accountant. And we'd have to pay for that advice. You know, I don't know what we're trying to do here. If we're trying to cut down on tax avoidance, great. Let's target those organisations that have significant tax avoidance. And that means targeting organisations ideally above 5 million or even above 1 million. If what we're trying to do is improve record keeping in every small not-for-profit across the country and get them to do an annual return, don't get the ATO to do it. It has a terrible record of engaging with this sector, not through want of trying, but just because of the core role of the ATO being about collecting revenue for government. That in itself becomes an impediment to effective engagement across our sector. So I'll stop there, Senator, or I might go on for too long and not allow time for questions. But again, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and it's fantastic that you're actually having this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Crosby. I'll go to Senator Walsh after myself, but just given your sort of long association with these issues, I'm curious to understand why it was that the ACNC review recommendation number 24 was not accepted by the government at the time. And the recommendation 24 goes to the issue of who is best able to regulate this particular issue, and whether or not you have any understanding or familiarity about why that was not agreed by the government at the time.
It's a really good question, Senator, and the short answer is I'm not sure. I have been around a little while. When governments allocate additional resources to the ATO, they usually expect a dividend. That is, if I give the ATO 10 more staff to engage in compliance, there's almost like a return on that. What will those 10 additional compliance officers produce in terms of additional revenue? I can only assume there was a revenue aspect to the regulation of not-for-profits, and that it was seen that the ATO, if more was invested in regulation, would be able to generate additional revenue. But I have no evidence to support that. That's just what I've seen, and I'm sure senators have seen previously in terms of allocations to the ATO.
Thank you for that. I can ask the ATO during the course of these hearings. In its submission to this inquiry, the Australian Taxation Office has said that just 5.5% of the potential not-for-profit population has provided or lodged their first return. Am I right to assume that it's still not too late to reform the implementation arrangements and reform them in a way that might better reflect issues around risk and proportionality, which you've identified in your submission, but others, like the Law Councils of Queensland, for example, have identified in their submissions as well?
I think, this whole idea that we can't change things has been told to me many, many times. Of course you can. Of course we can change it. We could change it tomorrow if we really wanted to. And this idea that we can't, I was told that about regulation of charities by the ATO over a decade ago. It's changed, and it's changed for the better. If we want to change the way we do this measure, we can change it. And all this argument that it has to be, using the ABR, the Australian Business Register, it has to be using a level 2 security MyGov ID. The ACNC collects annual returns through a purpose-designed portal that works incredibly well. And in fact, Senator, as you would know, being the Shadow Minister for Charities, the reality is that in Australia we have the highest voluntary compliance with annual returns to a regulator anywhere in the world. And the reason we have that is partly because the ACNC was purpose-designed to engage with charities and created purpose-designed portals to collect the information that was needed. The ATO is not designed to engage with charities or not-for-profits, and of course it's going to struggle with that task.
In many of the submissions that we've received from community organisations and not-for-profits, they do speak to the regulatory burden the imposition on volunteers at a time when getting volunteers is becoming more difficult, but also retaining volunteers is becoming more difficult. And I suspect this has been the case for a long time, but more particularly at the moment, not-for-profit organisations are sort of really front-facing in the community, you know, desiring to be more visible than they have been previously, you know, wanting to continue that sort of civil society benefit. As the CEO of the Peak Association, is that the feedback that you have been receiving as well?
And I think we've already heard this morning, it's difficult to get people to take on office bearer roles in voluntary organisations. And I mean, I haven't seen the research on this, but I can tell you, belonging to several volunteer organisations, I end up on committees and then I end up in officer roles, not because I want to, but because it's kind of last person standing kind of stuff. And if you're out of the room when these decisions are being made, often you'll come back in and find that you've been nominated for something. It's very hard. I mean, one of the issues we have in terms of volunteering is the kind of, what is the time commitment? What is my obligation? Can I meet that time commitment? When the government's imposing what, by any measure, is a very significant new imposition on not-for-profits, and requiring people to do a whole lot of documentation and extra work and time, days of time. You know, you can say it takes 5 minutes to complete the form. That is not people's experience. You can say this isn't a significant administrative burden. That is not people's experience. And one of the things that I find so frustrating, Senator, is that the dismissive approach of the ATO to people saying it takes time, it is complex, it is hard to go through all these steps. And there's this kind of sense of, no, it's not. The form only takes 8 minutes. Well, yes, it is. And you've heard that. I've heard that. And people don't want to have to do that. And what we are doing is driving volunteers away from our community groups that are so vital.
I will come to Senator Walsh in a moment. But Mr Crosbie, you are a member of the Not-for-Profit Stewardship Group, which is part of the ATO Charities Network. My words, not yours. How often has this issue been raised through that forum in bringing to the constant attention of the ATO just how real and severe the implementation process is on these smaller not-for-profit organisations?
It's been raised at every meeting for at least the last 2 years. And I have to say that Jennifer and Will have often initiated raising it. It's a standing agenda item on every meeting that we have. You know, I have no, I actually think the ATO Stewardship Group is a model that other agencies across the federal government would do well to look at, because it's a good way of engaging with charities and not-for-profits. My problem is that the engagement has been, and the concerns raised have been dismissed and continue to be dismissed. I'm hoping that through this process, they won't take such a dismissive approach and try and actually do something to address the fact that the measure is designed poorly, it's targeted poorly, and the process is a poor process.
Last question from me before I go to Senator Walsh. How would you characterise the Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and the Treasury, Dr Lee's level of awareness of this issue and the concerns that have been raised through the charities sector?
So the Assistant Minister for Charities attended the CCA board meeting, I think, within a few days of being appointed Minister for Charities. And I have to say he's been very engaged with the charity sector and with our organisation. I think one of the first issues we raised in our first meeting was that this measure would not work and that it needed to have a threshold, or it needed to be done by the ACNC. Two really simple things: either put in a threshold, we suggested 5 million, as did the ACNC independent panel of 2018, or get the ACNC to do it because they know how to engage with charities and not-for-profits.
Have any of those suggestions been taken up by the Assistant Minister? Has any commitment been given to prosecute those suggested reforms inside the government?
No.
Thank you. Senator Walsh. Oops.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Crosbie, for being with us and your evidence on this issue. As you said in your opening statement, the broad intent of the measure is to have a form of, oversight and accountability, and it's not about changing whether organisations are or are not tax exempt. It's moving from a self-assurance model, if you like, to a reporting model. And as you've said, there's a fair bit of history to all of this as well, going back to the 2018 ACNC review. As you said in your opening statement, it got picked up in a budget a couple of years ago, and it's now in effect for the last financial year. There's been a fair amount of consultation about it, and I want to come to that. There's been an extension of the time, in this first year to allow organisations to try to adapt. And I understand from your evidence and your submission that you think, there's still huge other measures that should be put in place, and indeed you think the ATO is not the right place for this. You think the ACNC is the right place for this. I just wanted to go back to the consultation. You've mentioned, and the Chair's asked you about this as well, the NFP group that you're part of with the ATO. Can you just tell us a bit more about that group and whether that group was consulted about this measure?
Yeah, the ATO Not-for-Profit Stewardship Group follows a model that the ATO established around small business and others, where there's stewardship groups that bring together people from the sector, people who are specialists who work into the sector, so lawyers, accountants and others, peak bodies, and broader representative groups, as well as sort of individual specialists in that area, and discuss issues that may relate to the role of the ATO and its engagement with that sector. The problem here, Senator, is, I'm trying to find polite words of saying this, but consultations with our sector can at times be incredibly hollow. It's all very well to say we've consulted. You've consulted, you've been told by an independent panel of experts that it should be organisations above 5 million. You've been told by the peak body for the charity sector it should be organisations above 5 million. You've been told by all these small organisations that it's too much and it's having a negative impact on them. So what do? You go ahead anyway. You call that consultation. I call that a dismissive approach to our sector, and it's consistent in the way we are treated by government departments and by others. Our concerns are dismissed.
Okay, so you don't find that group that you're on useful?
It's useful. It's very useful, and I've advocated for that group to be picked up by others. But it's at some point, it's not the group that is the issue. It's whether you act on the advice or the consultation findings that you have.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we do often, look at in Senate inquiries and ask about is what the sort of consultation has been up to for particular measures, and you're in the position where you can tell us a bit about the consultation that actually happened with the group that you're on. Can you tell us what happened?
Every time this measure was brought to that group, the need for a threshold, the need to not use ABR, the need to not use MyGov ID, or if you did use MyGov ID, not to have a level 2 security. So, you and I are registered on MyGov ID because we did when we had COVID and other things. But if you try and use that level of MyGov ID to do this return, it won't work. You have to get a level 2. I know because I tried. And I think
the consultation was like a meeting, a day, a form. Did you have any?
It was an ongoing.
Form?
It was a very long ongoing discussion. There were presentations. There were. I'd have to say, to be honest, there were arguments. We would say, this is what should happen. No, it can't. Well, why can't? And we would have quite open and honest arguments about it. I think it's a good forum in which to hold those arguments, and I think it worked very well. The problem is nothing changed. And I really do think in our sector we're used to that. People say they're consulting with you, they consult with you and then do what they were going to do anyway. And that's exactly what has happened here.
Yeah. And is it right that I'm just trying to sort of pin down what the either the main feedback was that you would have given then or your main sort of issues now. So it's not that people need to have more information, is it? Because they already had to assure themselves of their information. Now they have to report it. You mentioned the MyGov aspect there, that people have to get onto MyGov who might not have been on it. Is that the main difficulty?
So,
is it the form where they're having to put information that they would have already had to have in some form to do the self-assurance part of it?
So, Senator, I'm a part of, as I said, 2 tennis clubs, and we know that we're a not-for-profit that promotes sport. All our money goes into the tennis club. We don't need documentation to prove that. That's all we do. We have less than 150 members. We generate less than 50 grand, and we try and repair the fences and the nets and the court surfaces and things with whatever money we can raise. We're like thousands, over 100,000 not-for-profits around this country. You say, how do we self-assess that we're not-for-profit? Well, we promote sport. That's one of the 8 areas. So what do you mean documentation? It's all we do. And in most not-for-profits, this whole idea that we're collecting a suite of information to do an assessment, why would we do that? We're a tennis club. We play tennis. No one does anything else. We're not investing in the share market or doing it, we're not trying to make money or... So it's this whole notion of self-assessed. It's for most not-for-profits, it's just, what you do, what your purpose is. And yes, it's a not-for-profit purpose. That's as much as you need. To go onto the Australian Business Register, I don't know whether you've tried to change who's the responsible person on the Australian Business Register, but it's not easy. I've even had cases brought to me where people went to a widow's house to go through documents left by the late husband to find out if he was the responsible person on the ABR, because they couldn't find out who was. Then, even if you get through the ABR, and I dare you to do it, go and try and do it. Then you go to MyGov, and as I said, I've used MyGov. Most of the people I know have used MyGov because that's where we kept our COVID registers and things. I thought I'd be fine. I go onto MyGov to do this form and I can't because I haven't got a level 2 security. So I have to provide additional documentation to qualify for a level 2 security. It's only then that I get to the form. You can't actually get to the form until you've been through those two. When I do an annual return to the ACNC for my charity, the Community Council for Australia, I go into the ACNC portal and I complete the questions, and that's it. So how come I can do that, and I'm a charity, and charities have a lot more money than not-for-profits? How come charities can just do an annual return through a portal designed for them that collects all the information, responsible people, everything else, but we have to go in through these really not very user-friendly ways? And you're asking small, not-for-profit, volunteer people to do this for what purpose?
Well,
tell me for what purpose.
Mr. Crosby, in fairness, what I'm doing is, as a member of the committee, asking you questions.
Sorry, but you could.
Doing, Mr. Crosby.
I apologise, Senator, but
passionate about the issue, but
frustrated is the word, I think, Senator. You've
identified some parts of it that are really challenging. Obviously, you know the background of the whole measure. We've already talked about that. It goes back a few years, and now it's sort of come on, I think, is what's happening. I think I probably know your answer to this, given your levels of frustration / passion about the issue, but I'll put the question, which is, the measure's been a while sort of in the making. We're now sort of in it. I guess what's happened is there's been, an extension of the time people have until March 31st. As you mentioned, there's been, a number of new people put on in the ACNC to help people. There's been a number of people put on in the ATO to help people. There's been phone assistance provided to adjust to the change. Do you think that in the next year, when there's, people have been through it once, and when there's the pre-fill that the ATO is committed to do, that it will be somewhat easier to comply with the measure going forward?
I think it'll be marginally easier. I don't think it'll be easy. I think it's still a mess, and you'll often get more new people who have to go through that whole process of the ABR, the MyGov ID level 2 security before they can get to the form. You're still going to get a lot not-for-profits who feel, as my president did, that we need to take it to a specialist and go to a taxation office, taxation agent, or they're going to have to go to lawyers, to as many organisations, from community radio stations to agricultural farms. They're going to have to, or parents and citizens clubs, they're going to have to redo their constitution, which means legal advice, which means costs. What we're doing is ripping money out of the community to complete a measure. And the reason I'm asking what the purpose is, not so much of you, Senator, but to make the point that if what we're trying to do is get tax avoiders, target the tax avoiders, by all means, let's start with not-for-profits above 5 million. If what we're trying to do is improve governance and have better records, as we have done in the specialist agency, you wouldn't get the ATO to try and improve the quality in this country. Even though there are tax implications around alcohol sold and revenue and everything else, you leave it to specialists, liquor licensing commissions. I don't think the ATO is the ABS. I don't think it should be trying to collect data about how many not-for-profits there are in this country. I think it's got an incredibly important role, which I think it does incredibly well, which is trying to keep the tax system fair and equitable. And I don't think it gets enough credit for some of the work that it does behind the scenes. But in this case, they are the wrong agency to be trying to engage across the country.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'll put some matters that you've raised to the ATO, including around the consultation with the NFP stewardship group that you've raised today. Thanks for your evidence. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Senator. The one other thing I'd add is I think we did alter the form a bit through the not-for-profit stewardship group, but not the process. Not the process at all.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Walsh. Mr Crosbie, just from two questions from myself. There's two issues here. There's the recommendation 24 of the ACNC review of 2018, but then there is the second issue, and that is the why the ATO or why the government hasn't then and hasn't now adopted the threshold consideration. Your submission makes it very, very clear that the burden of this falls on small not-for-profits in terms of the number of them. You've also made the point, you know, what is the mischief that this particular approach is seeking to mitigate? So why is it that the advocacy around the thresholds has not been successful?
I feel very bad about that, to be honest. I feel as though we haven't been good advocates, clearly, because we've been advocating for a threshold for 5 years. And so did the ACNC. So have many major groups around this country representing parts of our sector. I think we're not very good advocates, might be one explanation, and I'm happy to wear that, you know, we lose more often than we win in terms of advocating for our sector into government. I don't think we're taken very seriously as a group. I don't think our needs are taken. I'm not talking about just this government, but historically. You know, I think our sector is generally just expected to pick up the pieces when things go wrong, and not to sort of seek to try and improve itself, but to try and improve the communities that it serves. And sometimes we actually need to think about the sector itself and what it needs, but rarely is that given the kind of value and importance that it should, in my view. So I think we fail at that sense, something that, you know, we talk about and we worry about quite a lot.
Mr Crosbie, it sounds like you need better friends. I don't expect you to comment on that. My second question goes to the pressure on the ACNC, because you're also a member of the advisory panel for the ACNC. And of course, they've made a submission as well. So how regularly is this issue being raised through the ACNC advisory panel mechanism? And in that role, are you able to make some comments about the additional burden that the ACNC is already carrying as a result of the implementation process?
Well, the ACNC Advisory Board, and you know, I'm not sure I could speak for the ACNC Advisory Board, but its purpose is partly to provide advice to the Commissioner and some measure of oversight in the sense of, you know, checking the performance of the ACNC against key metrics. You know, how is it going in terms of the time it takes to process a new application? How's it going in terms of investigating charities when there's complaints? And how are we going in terms of preparing reports and getting annual returns? So there's a kind of oversight of the work of the ACNC and a discussion generally at that forum about how we can improve it. Clearly, this measure has had an impact on the ACNC, and that impact has meant that some of the performance measures have slipped. And so it's been a subject of discussion at each ACNC Advisory Board meeting. Pleasingly, relatively recently, I'm sure the Commissioner Sue will explain more, has been given some additional resources. I know there was a Senate estimates question asked about what additional resources have been allocated for this measure to the ATO and how that was working. And my understanding was that less than 5 new people were allocated. was the response. It was a written response. We've got now, I believe, and just looking at the ACNC submission, 25 new staff, and still it's taking months before we can get new applications assessed. So it used to take 14 days before assessment was underway, and completion of assessment, I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, was actually quite quick. That's not the case now. So it's had a material impact on the work of the ACNC.
Thank you very much for your evidence, Mr. Crosbie. We appreciate that, and I will have an opportunity to question the ACNC. If you do have any comments or suggestions about what might be a more appropriate pathway to give effect to the intention of the reporting requirement, if you have any additional comments in terms of what might be a more suitable pathway, then we'd be very pleased to hear from you. Thank you again for your evidence today. The committee has agreed that responses to questions on notice should be provided by the close of business Friday the 25th of October 2024. We thank you again for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you to the Economic References Committee for this hearing. And it's wonderful that people are actually prepared to listen to the voices of small not-for-profits and people speaking on their behalf, because I think, as I've said, I do get a very consistent feeling that those voices are being dismissed.
Perhaps by some, but not by all. Thank you very much, Mr. Crosbie. I now welcome Landcare Victoria and the Paynesville Landcare Coast Care Group. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today, beginning with Ms. Hetzel.
Thank you, Senator. So my name is Claire Hetzel and I'm the CEO at Landcare Victoria Incorporated. We're the peak body for more than 600 groups across Victoria caring for our environments.
Thank you very much for your participation today. And Dr. Peel.
Good morning, Senator. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. I am the president of the Paynesville Landcare Group Incorporated, which is a very small group of, like the majority of landcare groups, and in fact the majority of volunteer groups across Australia, consists of older persons with failing numbers and increasing difficulty to engage people in volunteer groups. And therefore my concerns are around the survival of small groups like ours and the actions by the ATO to make life even harder, in our view, unnecessarily. And that's the matter I'd like to speak to you about.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peel. Thank you both for your participation today. I now invite you to make a short opening statement if you desire. We do have your written submissions, and at the conclusion of your opening remarks, I'll invite members of the committee to ask questions, and I'll go to Senator Walsh to begin. Ms. Hetzel, would you like to make an opening statement?
I would. Thank you, Senator. So the Landcare movement in Victoria is made up of community-led environmental volunteering groups and networks that provide leadership for on-ground action, solving local issues relating to landscapes and communities. So as the peak body, we represent more than 600 groups and an estimated 60,000 volunteers taking action across Victoria. Our data from our annual census recognises that more than 80% of our 624 groups are impacted by the reform process, and only a minority, 13% of these groups, are already registered as charities with the ACNC. Across Australia, there is a network of more than 6,000 landcare groups, so the scale of this impact is significant. I'd like this Senate committee to recognise that more than half of our groups are dealing in an annual income of less than $10,000, and so many of these groups are small collectives who bring in-kind time and resources. They put aside land and care for our environment in ways that aren't tangible in money, but are having to deal with and grapple with this change in a really complex environment. Like Russell noted, many of these committees are struggling to bring people willing to do administration. Landcare itself, though, is growing in terms of its participation for on-ground action. No one wants to turn up to do administration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Peel, would you like to make an opening statement?
Thank you. If I have leave of the senators, I'd like to add something that's come up more recently before I talk about the specific issue that my submission's about. Is that okay?
You can, as long as it's the subject of this inquiry.
Yep. Has a lot to do with the points made by the previous speaker, Mr. Crosby. I am both a public officer and secretary for a yacht club, a sporting organisation, as well as for a president of the Landcare Group, also an incorporated body. And both those bodies, because they're incorporated, have clauses in their rules of governance that state that they may not distribute any profits. They cannot make profits. Therefore, they're inherently a not-for-profit organisation. The fact that they're an incorporated association, unable to distribute profits to anybody. So I just make that point up front, but I have the chance to see the dichotomy between the way these two entities are treated by the ATO. I don't know what the background is to why the ATO has taken this action. All I can see are the repercussions of it. Now, in relation to the yacht club, I'll come back to Landcare in a second, we are a sporting body. Therefore, we are a body that the ATO has decided is permitted to self-review. And it's dead easy for us to review that we are a not-for-profit. We're clearly, as the previous speaker said, not-for-profit. Our rules say we're a not-for-profit. And therefore, I started to try and do the process. And as the previous speaker said, going through MyGov, I have a MyGov, I'm already linked to 3 other organisations through the RAM, the Relationship Association Manager, and I tried to link to a yacht club. The system tells me I can't do that because I'm not listed with the ABR. So I called the ABR and identified myself and said, I have this problem. Can you tell me who our listed authorised members are so I can contact them and get them to work with me? I said, no, you're not an authorised person, therefore we can't tell you who the authorised persons are. These were people who 20 years ago set up the ABN, probably dead, if not dead, certainly in their 80s or 90s. They've forgotten long ago. We're a small organisation that turns over committees frequently. We don't have records, we don't have handovers, all that stuff. We're not a professional group. We're a group of volunteers running a volunteer organisation for people to go sailing. So the ABR wouldn't tell me. I was then told by one of the ABR officers if I filled out the application form to make a change to the ABN details, even though I didn't fill out the part about the authorised officer, they would process it. I waited 2 months and no response. I called again and another officer told me, you can't do that. They won't accept that form if it's not signed. But the ABR didn't even recognise the form I submitted to them, have nothing from them whatsoever after 3 months. So I then started chasing around and eventually have found a very helpful resource who's a tax agent who has totally separate access. And by chance, because he's a volunteer with the club and he was willing to do it, he has spent a lot of hours and has fixed it. But while he was doing that, I looked on the form and thought, okay, there's a paragraph down the bottom here that says I can do a phone submission. So yesterday morning, I got on the phone, fully automated system. As far as I can see, the system didn't identify me. My grandmother could have filled out the form. And I click 1 or 2 for yes, no for the questions asked, and then click 1 for your self-review is completed. Now, the dichotomy between going through MyGov, having to be an authorised person on the ABR, and then submitting online versus phoning up without even needing to identify yourself, as far as I could see, and still having the very simple questions, which I've explained are already listed in our Rules of Association, and we're listed with the Victorian Consumer Affairs Department already. So they're totally unnecessary and pointless. Governments already have all that information. Is just ridiculous. So that's about the process and the yacht club. It's completed, simple set of questions, don't need any information to answer them. They're all simple yes. Obviously, we only deal in Australia. Obviously, our rules say we can't distribute profits, blah, blah, blah. So it's a nonsense to ask those questions because there's nothing else to ask for. So that's the process. Now we come to the dichotomy between the two. I'm allowed to do that for the yacht club, which turns over about $150,000 a year, has over 300 members. The whole reason for it existing is to provide resources and facilities and opportunities for those members. So it's basically a selfish purpose to create for those group of members an amenity that they share. And it's clearly a not-for-profit. Our Landcare group is about 40 in total, 15 active members who pay $10 a year each to be a member. They donate their time to work. We only work on public land. We work on behalf of our local government who are under-resourced and not capable of fully looking after and caring for the public land in our community. And this group of people who are all in their 70s spend our time working on public land, improving a community amenity. And occasionally we apply for a grant to do some pathway or something, and to do that we have to have an ABN, and hence we're caught up in this horrendous net. Our total income in an average year is $900, and of that, $600 goes straight to Landcare Victoria for insurance. So we have $300 left over, and yet we have told we have to join ACNC, which I personally refuse to do on principle. I've done the process. I was the one who registered the East Gippsland Landcare Network to ACNC, so I can do the process easily. I just refuse to do it because it's totally ridiculous for a small group like ours. We're not a charity. We're a group of people improving a public amenity in the same way that Lions do, the same way that Rotary do, the same way that any community group do. And yet the ATO have specifically excluded us from being permitted to self-review because we're an environmental group and therefore we're different from a sporting group. I have no idea why. It's totally illogical. Presumably they have some reason, but they've created a trap which is picked up, as Claire says, huge number of organisations completely unnecessarily. If we were allowed to self-review, I wouldn't have a concern because it's a dead simple process aside from the stupid issues with ABR and MyGov I've already mentioned. But we could do that, and I'd do that happily. The issue is they have excluded us from being able to self-review.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peel.
Those are the points laid out in my submission. Thanks, Senators.
Thank you very much. Senator Walsh.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you both very much for coming today and also for the work that you do with Landcare. I'll just start with you, Ms Hetzel, if I can. You have an idea in your submission about sort of how to deal with this, and it's around a sort of a micro charity concept. So again, I guess, the background to this issue is, there was a review in 2018 around the ACNC. It was picked up by a government in 2021, sort of, put into the budget. We're now in the phase where it's the first year of this measure. It's being implemented. It's moving from that self-assurance process to, what you're all talking about. Filling out the forms, going onto the Australian Business Register, the MyGov, all of that sort of stuff. There's some help that's being provided in the first year, some extension of time, some phone resources, some additional resources, and those sorts of things. I guess you have this other concept that you've brought forward in your submission, which is around the idea of creating a category and a process for micro charities, and I'm just interested to hear a bit more about the thinking around that as another way.
Thank you, Senator. So I guess it speaks to that issue that Russell is really highlighting on a personal level, which is so many of these groups who've been tangled up in this process are really quite small, and the work that they do collectively is exceptionally important for the state of Victoria and ultimately Australia. So when you think about the need to, I imagine the motivation that I hear behind these reforms is to get some transparency on the income that's coming through this sector. And Landcare Victoria is able to quantify that as a $35 million annual income in 2023 for our groups. But individually, each of them are very small, and more than half are dealing in tiny grants to do great work for the public. So if they're not able to self-review because of, as I understand it, the categorisation of environmental groups under the Charities Act, then there needs to be a simple process that allows them to identify themselves as a charity with charitable purposes, but doesn't require the unbelievable number of hoops that are required to make it through that ACNC registration process. That's not the fault of the ACNC, but the process required to, if you're an unincorporated group, establish rules for the first time that really define those charity purposes. To do that, you have to pull together an annual general meeting and make constitutional kind of statements as a collective, and then follow through a whole other process to be able to register. And then there's concerns about ensuring that they meet that annual reporting requirement and all the other steps that go with becoming a registered charity. So if there's no way to raise the threshold or somehow reallocate environmental groups to a simpler pathway, what we're suggesting is there needs to be a simpler pathway created than the one currently available under the ACNC charity registration process.
Okay. And so I'm learning some things today as a member of the committee, and so you're talking about the difference between going through this ATO process versus going through a self-review process that I think Mr. Peel talked about. If you're a registered charity, and you're saying that it's easier to do the charity process.
As I understand it, the ATO process is the self-review process. So if you're a sporting group, like Russ has talked about in terms of his sailing club, you can tick that you're a sporting club, and you can then self-review with the ATO. Many Landcare groups, because they also deliver for the community, have thought that they met the category around community groups under that self-review process. But as we've uncovered and worked with the ACNC to clarify, the primary purposes of any of our members is ultimately to work to support the environment, the protection of the environment, which means that they can't go through the ATO self-review process. They ultimately get kicked over to this other category, which, to ensure that they don't become a taxable not-for-profit, requires them to become registered with the ACNC. Now, that ricocheting effect of a change for a subsection of groups at the ATO is no one's taking responsibility for the impact that has happened for all of these other groups, environmental groups in particular, who now have to grapple with a charity registration process via the ACNC, or do an assessment as a committee to say that work isn't worth it, we're going to become a taxable not-for-profit, and then create a cycle of government grant money coming to the group and potentially being taxed by the government to go back to the government, and requiring accounting and a level of sophistication that the groups are probably not ready for and don't have resource support to get in within the timeframes available to them. I hope that answered your question, Senator.
Thank you. And just for sort of clarification, this is about a change as discussed. It's been in the pipeline for a while, but it doesn't change whether you are or are not tax exempt. It just changes the previous system where organisations sort of assured themselves of that with, I guess, very limited oversight from either the ACNC or the ATO to a system where now, in order to have that tax exempt status, there's, this process, this ATO process, where you have to go through that people are talking to us about, involving making sure it's the right person with the ABN, and using MyGov and so on. And so is your advice is that that's a difficult process for people to go through, despite the extension of time and the resources that are available and so on.
I guess what we're saying is that a lot of landcare groups across the country they were not aware that they were self-reviewing by and assessing themselves as income tax exempt. And this change has highlighted the fact that for them to actually legitimise that position, they have to become a registered charity because they're not able to self-review under the ATO process. So the pathway for an environmental volunteer organisation is charity registration with the ACNC, even if they've got a $500 grant and a little bit of membership money and they're just caring for a patch locally to them. And then the process to actually do that requires a significant number of hurdles to go through. And as you've heard from Russell, he feels very strongly that that's not what should be the pathway for a small environmental collective like a landcare group.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that. Ms Hersel, I was under the impression, and I think this had been said in public forum, that the ACNC was in fact engaging with Landcare around some of the difficulties that you were experiencing. Can you share with the committee how successful that engagement has been with the ACNC thus far?
I have to say that the ACNC, even with limited resources, have worked hard to support us as a small organisation ourselves. I guess what we've seen is that they have heard and they've responded with, some really useful tools on their website. But what I want to highlight is that groups don't know that they need to go and look and trawl through the information on the ACNC website. And the information that they receive that is making them quite scared and responding with a bit of panic comes from the ATO. And that information is misleading because it says you have an ABN and you need to undertake a self-review or, in small print, find your pathway to the ACNC to become a registered charity. So I would say that initial point of contact is a very easy win in terms of actually creating clear advice to an organisation like a Landcare Group around what they might need to do, given they don't fit the self-review categories as a community organisation. And the lack of responsibility at that point of contact that I'm seeing and the frustration I'm hearing from groups is they then go through this process of trying to update their ABNs, and as Russell said, that's not a simple process. And then they go through that ATO self-review thing only to find out that's not the administrative hurdle they need to jump. It is actually with the ACNC. So while I would say the ACNC has been responding, groups even finding them way there and then managing their process to become registered, it's just not being understood and resourced in a way that's creating a lot of confusion and frustration and anger across the sector.
Now, Landcare has been alert to these issues for a while and engaged with the ACNC. Has that frustration been growing amongst Landcare groups?
I'd have to say that only a very small handful have managed to make it all the way through the charity registration process in the timeframe that we've been able to communicate to them around, and then for them to be able to get their committees together, to set purposes, to redo all of the information, to then put it into the ACNC portal. So I'd say that there is frustration still in trying to get clear on the steps and then to be able to navigate them, let alone to be able to make it through. And there is palpable frustration and an unwillingness to engage in this process with volunteers who don't understand what the change is, why they now have to spend significant hours trying to navigate it when nothing has changed. And ultimately, it's just to meet the same understanding of being a charity who doesn't have to pay tax as they had last year.
In your submission, you make the point that the administrative burden has simply become too heavy to bear and that some land care groups are now winding up, which are your words. Are you able to identify which land care groups have actually wound up or are winding up?
Yeah, so we have a very strong linkage to more than 60 networks across Victoria, and those networks then support between, sort of 25 groups, ultimately as a kind of hub and spokes process. We're working with those networks to understand and take a snapshot of their groups, and what we've provided in our submission is some examples where very clearly some of the strong networks who are still grappling with this issue themselves are notifying us to say that a proportion of their collectives are saying, actually, this is the straw that breaks the camel back. Is there a way that we can still care for the environment but not have to deal in red tape? So I guess there is no resourcing for networks to suddenly catch, all the volunteers of 3 groups and take on their responsibilities to deliver on their projects. So they're just not in a position to kind of respond in a way that will have positive outcomes for those communities.
Thank you very much. Also in your submission, you make the point that some emergency funding from the Victorian state government has been made available. Is that specifically in addition to this issue, or is it just generally they've made some funding available?
So I will say that the state of Victoria, who birthed Landcare, which has become a global movement, we have a really strong relationship with our state government, and we were able to speak to them about our significant concerns of the impact of these changes for our volunteer sector. They've provided some financial support specifically for this issue so that we can provide one-on-one clinics, so that we can provide webinars, and we can actually translate what is almost incomprehensible to many volunteers, the information coming from the ACNC and the ATO. So plain language, clear to understand information has been ultimately, and a trusted pathway to access that, being what the state government has invested in. And that's for an environmental portfolio that clearly shouldn't be propping up this issue.
We are limited for time, so I would like to thank Dr. Peel and Ms Herzl for your contributions this morning and your written submissions. They have been very, very important for raising the level of awareness and providing the committee with quite important information and evidence for our inquiry. So we thank you very much for your participation this morning. And if questions have been taken on notice, we would be grateful if those responses could be provided to the committee by the close of business on Friday, the 25th of October. And we thank you again for your contributions.
Thank you, Senators.
Thanks, Senators.
Okay, well, we thank you very much for your participation. I now welcome the Law Council of Australia, the Queensland Law Society, Mr Peter Fitzpatrick. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today, beginning with the Law Council of Australia? Ms McDougall, I think you're on mute.
Has to happen. I apologise. I'm Alice McDougall and I appear as the Deputy Chair of the Charities and Not-for-Profits Committee of the Law Council of Australia.
Thank you very much. And representatives of the Queensland Law Society?
Good morning. My name is Wendy Devine. I'm from the Queensland Law Society.
Good morning. My name is Emeritus Professor Miles McGregor-Lowndes and I'm a member of the Queensland Law Society Not-for-Profit Committee.
Thank you very much. And Mr Fitzpatrick? Mr Fitzpatrick, you might be on mute also. Oop. Mr Fitzpatrick, I think you're still on mute.
Is that better?
That's better, yes. If you'd just like to, for the sake of the record, just state your full name and the capacity in which you're appearing today.
Peter Fitzpatrick. I have been a governance trainer, strategic advisor, and chair and director of many not-for-profits over a 40-year period.
Thank you all very much for your appearance today. I might begin and then invite Senator Walsh to ask some other questions. Just to the Law Council of Australia, in your submission to the committee, in paragraph 2, you note that you had written to the Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury and the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Financial Services about the issues that we're canvassing today on the 11th of July 2024. Have you received a response to those 2 letters?
No, we haven't received a response. And apologies, it should have been attached to the submission. I hope that you've received it by now, a copy of that letter.
That's right, yeah, but I was just more interested in your response. If a response is made available to you in the next few hours or next few days, if you'd make that available to the committee, we'd be most appreciative. I'm curious to know, and perhaps given your extensive experience, this is the question to all the witnesses. I'm just curious to know what you understand the reasoning to be for the decision of the government in its response to the ACNC review of 2018 not to adopt recommendation 24, which suggested that these types of matters would be better regulated by the ACNC than the ATO. Can anyone provide any context to that?
Senator, I could probably say something about that. I think the ACNC was originally set up to look at the not-for-profit sector, but given the size of the sector, there's probably up to 600,000 not-for-profits in Australia. The ACNC has focused all of its attention on charities, and the not-for-profit sector has not been included previously. But the big mistake here, I think, is that outside of charities are only at this stage only about 10% of the overall not-for-profit sector. And so you now have a tiger by the tail, I suppose, because you've now got this very large sector covering a whole lot of areas that government, in many cases, has no capacity to deal with some of the social and other problems that are involved in this sector. And now calling them to task to say that you now need to become charities virtually to continue to receive tax deductibility. And in many cases, that is not possible because they don't fit the very rigorous requirements under the Tax Act of advancing health and education and social welfare and so on. But they are providing invaluable services to the community. The last update I got on this from a very reliable source of ChatGPT is that there's 1.3 million people employed in this sector. There is 10% of the workforce of Australia. There's 129 billion added to the Australian economy each year in this sector. Charities are only one small part of that. And there's a whole lot of sectors out there that don't qualify as for-profits because they don't distribute income to their members or to themselves each year. They simply use that income to do good work. And now we're saying that because they actually provide services to members which are essential to the Australian community, they no longer qualify for the tax exemption and they don't qualify to be charities. So you've wedged a whole lot of very good community organisations in a way that they'll be unable to, in many cases, to survive and in many cases provide greatly limited services, and the government will have to pick up the slack.
Thank you, Mr Fitzpatrick. I slightly got ahead of myself. My apologies to witnesses. The process is I then invite you to make an opening statement if you so choose to do so, and I'm hoping that you will. So would anyone like to begin with an opening there's no obligation to make an opening statement, but would anyone like to begin with an opening statement? Ms McDougall?
Yes, so I will just do a short introduction here. Look, our committee has been concerned with the imposition of this policy and its implementation. We've corresponded in these while this policy and implementation has been taking place with the ATO in relation particularly to the guidance on the website, which has been confusing to a lot of people and not adequate in explaining the difference between various categories and what is a charity. We similarly had correspondence with the ACNC in relation to backdating and other reporting issues for entities that were previously self-assessing but now realise they should have been registered as charities. And also in relation to managing the timeframes, resources and support to not-for-profit and charities. We presented on this to the ACNC Advisory Board and we've written, as you've seen, to Ministers Lee and Jones, urging them to at least ensure that the threshold for next year is increased. The Law Council Committee absolutely supports tax integrity, but this must be done with reasonable, proportional and responsible regulation that does not impose unnecessary burdens and red tape, particularly on small volunteer community groups. Neither the policy nor the implementation seems to have considered the numerous micro-volunteer organisations which could fall into one of the categories of Division 50 or could be charitable, and the line between some of these categories is invisible. The guidance has been inadequate and has not been updated as the time progressed. The impact is being felt on the wider charitable sector as the ACNC and the ATO have been really overwhelmed with this. I'll leave it there, but I'm delighted to be able to answer any questions the committee has.
Thank you, Ms McDougall. Would representatives of the Queensland Law Society like to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we do have a short statement to deliver this morning, and thank you for the opportunity to appear today. In opening, I would like to respectfully recognise the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet. My name is Wendy Devine, and I'm the Manager of Legal Policy at the Queensland Law Society, and I'm joined today by Emeritus Professor Miles McGregor-Lowndes, who, as Miles indicated, is a member of the QLS Not-for-Profit Law Committee. Miles is also a member of the Law Council's Not-for-Profit Law Committee and a founding and current member of the ACNC Advisory Board, but does not speak for them today. The Queensland Law Society Not-for-Profit Law Committee has closely followed the development of these new requirements since it was announced in 2021. We were so concerned that we met with the ATO on the 5th of June 2023 to discuss our concerns, and we subsequently made a detailed submission to the ATO in relation to the draft legislative instrument, and a copy of this was included with our written submission to the inquiry. The Society has no time for tax abusive behaviour in the Australian non-profit sector, and we support the ATO and the ACNC in their regulatory functions. Chronic tax abusive behaviour in relation to non-profit organisations in North America should not be permitted to gain a foothold here. However, we note that in the budget estimates of 2022 to 23, the ATO advised this committee that there were no cases of sham self-assessing income tax exempt entities in that year. In our written submission, QLS highlighted our concerns that the new regulatory requirements are not proportionate to the mischief and that the significant compliance costs will be particularly felt by smaller not-for-profit entities. We have suggested an alternative policy approach in our submissions, and we look forward to discussing that today with the committee. I would just invite Miles to add a few extra comments to complete our opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. I acknowledge that this committee's brief is largely about the implementational process of the measure, but my root cause analysis suggests that the initial policy departed from carefully considered recommendations and was flawed. It is not proportional and the responsibility was not located with the ACNC. The government has not articulated a cogent reason for its regulatory approach. We could have expected this in a regulatory impact statement or a regulatory impact assessment, but they weren't made public if they were done. The government merely in its response to the ACNC review said that eligibility for income tax exemptions and other tax concessions for non-charitable, not-for-profits is best regulated by the ATO. And I've not been able to find nothing else official about what was behind that reasoning. QLS suggests the ACNC is indeed better placed to implement and manage this regulatory reform, given their expertise not only with charities but also with not-for-profits in Australia. As outlined in our written submission, the alternative policy approach of setting up a revenue threshold over which large organisations must register with the ACNC to access tax concessions would be more proportionate to any risk to the tax revenue. We would further argue that Division 50 of the Income Tax Assessment Act that underlies the self-assessment return is not fit for purpose. In fact, one of Australia's most respected tax professors, Professor Anne O'Connell of Melbourne University, in a refereed journal, called Division 50 a dog's breakfast of a piece of legislation. And the public have experienced difficulties to date to comply with these returns. These have mainly been not with filling out the form itself, but with ancillary matters of getting access to the ATO platform through the Australian Business Register, which itself needs reform and which was partway through and then stopped. And we really encourage the government to get on with that reform because it's clearly needed with the MyGov. We've outlined further detail in our written submissions.
Thank you very much. And just for completeness, Mr Fitzpatrick, do you have a brief opening statement?
Yes, Senator, thank you. As I mentioned earlier, I've had 40 years experience in this area, working across a wide range of not-for-profits, chairing many of those. I've also been a CEO in the sector of the Law Society of Western Australia for 11 years and the motor industry in Western Australia for 11 years. I've seen quite a bit of it, and I still do a lot of work in the area of startups and assisting not-for-profits with their governance and strategy training. Because it's been my experience over the years that, and a crucial insight for me is that the caring community can never be defined or delivered by a government because governments invariably lack collective kindness. No government really understands fully the types of solutions that are needed to community and social problems. This is the home soil of the not-for-profit sector, the third sector as it's often called. This ruling will devastate this sector. It will impact severely on employment, service delivery, volunteerism, and is yet another example of government intrusion and control into central planning and ultimately over individual lives. The ATO policy is causing considerable disruption to the sector, as far as I can see already, for the number of organisations that have come to me seeking support. And many of them are talking about reducing services and reducing employment and wondering what they're going to do with their very large groups of volunteers. The intention seems to be to force not-for-profits into becoming charities, though the objects of many of these organisations don't fit those rigorous requirements. And if you look at the main sticking point here is that they don't qualify as charities. And then when you look at the ATO clarification of their initial ruling, if the organisation's main purpose is merely to provide service to its members, it won't be exempt. This is the case even if those services result in better use of resources for those members. Well, that rules out a whole lot of not-for-profits because the whole purpose of a not-for-profit is to provide services to members. And and many of them won't qualify to go into that ACNC charity sort of link. So the argument is, why are we doing this? Not-for-profits, I have yet, in all my years, have yet to find a not-for-profit that distributes income to or surpluses to its members. That would make them then a for-profit. So I just sometimes wonder what evil we're trying to address here, and why we're going about this path of destruction of many invaluable services that are being provided to the community, services that the government will be unable to afford if these organisations cut back or are forced to close their doors.
Thank you, Mr Fitzpatrick. I'll invite Senator Walsh to begin with questions.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you all for being there. I might, with this panel, go back to some of the principles about, what's being attempted here rather than the operational issues that we're hearing about from those witnesses who are dealing with the system that's been set up. So at a threshold level, I think you've all said, certainly the Law Council and the Queensland Law Society have said that there's a need and, of course, support for, transparency and integrity in the tax system in general, and that principle is agreed. And then going back to where this came from, so this came from the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission legislation review of 2018, which it sounds like you're have been engaged with for a period of time, and then the government response that was given in 2020. So back in 2018, the recommendation, which the Chair's been mentioning as well, recommendation 24, was that essentially these non-charity, not-for-profits that we're talking about should be registered with the ACNC if they have a revenue of 5 million or more. So there was a threshold there. And then the government response at the time in 2020 was to not support the recommendation and to consider that this group of non-charity, not-for-profits are best regulated by the ATO. And it should be looked at how to do that. And that's sort of essentially the background to where we are today. I guess if that's right, and you can tell me if there's anything else to add there, but is your advice to the committee that the non-charity not-for-profits with smaller revenues, say of under 5 million, should just continue to self-assess? Is that your advice, or is it that, given there's been a consensus, it seems, for a few years that they should self-assess and they should be with the ATO, just that there'd be a better system for it? So, yeah, Ms McDougall, if you could start off with that.
Yes, so I don't think there was any more explanation given in relation to, why the rollout is applied to everyone. But for me, the main sticking point is the reasonableness and the impact, the amount of red tape and burden on the smaller organisations. So I can't understand why the recommendation, which was clearly phrased to say, okay, perhaps there may be a risk, in this larger group that is self-assessing. So let's ask them to put in a return and make sure, that there is tax integrity in relation to that. And that's reasonable in terms of a larger organisation. But in terms of then when you go into the smaller organisations, the balance between the risk, the proportionality of the regulation is completely lost. And as we can see, has caused quite a lot of disruption. As far as I know, that no particular reasons have been given in relation to this.
So your view, and please correct me, but your view is that the organisations below that previous threshold, that was given in 2018 or some similar threshold, should just continue to do a self-assurance program.
That's right. I think that's the short-term recommendation, and definitely I think what needs to happen is actually Division 50 needs to be examined, and there needs to be much better clarity as to the categories which can self-assess and why they are different from charities, and have a very clear delineation between those that are charities and those which the government is still happy to be tax exempt, and on what basis and what are their characteristics.
And thank you. And then I'll sort of ask this question and then just perhaps get some comments from the Queensland Law Society as you'd like to give them on the same sort of area. But in terms of the sort of the reasonableness test that you talked about, Ms. McDougall, I guess in terms of trying to implement this measure that goes back to sort of 2020 and was put in the budget in 2021-22, I think, and is now in place. There's measures around, an extended time period, so March 31, 2025 instead of October. There's sort of, I think from the submissions, 25 extra people being put on at the ACNC to field the inquiries about, should I become a charity? There's extra people being put on it. The ATO, there's phone help, all of those things. Do those things sort of assist in terms of reasonableness to use your measure?
No, so I think the fundamental issue in reasonableness is exactly why we're asking these people to put in a return. Exactly what is the risk? Why is it reasonable to impose this burden on these small volunteer organisations? That's my reasonableness. The fact that a whole lot of people needed to have been put on is after these community groups are already distressed. And I mean, I applaud that now they're putting people on to try and help them, but a lot of times it's really difficult to tell. And I think you're probably hearing that people are getting conflicting answers from different people. And I mean, as an practitioner who's been working in this area for over 20 years, there are cases where you kind of go, okay, well, that could take a lot of analysis to determine whether it's a charity or whether it should be under one of these Division 50 categories. But I think fundamentally the reasonableness is around the size of, the organisations and the burden and the risk.
Okay, thank you. And for the Queensland Law Society, did you have any sort of comments on, where this came from, I guess, back in the 2018 ACNC review? The government, response at the time was to say, well, this is, these organisations of this scale are better off being dealt with by the ATO, these non-charity, not-for-profits, not by the ACNC as recommended. How do you see, I guess, the underpinnings of the system that's being implemented today?
Yeah, I can't find anything on the public record by the government about why they made that response to the ACNC review. I can tell you that in the ACNC review, there was discussion about non-profits rather than charities filing returns with the register, and that this ought to be proportional. The review eventually settled on 5 million, but I note that the ATO, I'll say that again, the ATO, in its written submission to that review, indicated that it thought that the appropriate threshold was $1 million, followed by later period from those with a turnover between 250 and $1 million. So the ATO, in its advice to the ACNC review, said that the threshold should be $1 million for the first period, and then in succeeding years brought down in a graduated way. And that's very sensible. Why the review actually settled on 5 million, I don't know, and why the government, even with that view expressed in that review by the ATO, decided to go another way, perplexed us who follow this sort of area of the law. And I'd always want to back up Alice and the Law Council about the underlying legislation in Division 50. It needs a good spring clean. Now, let me give you some examples which may bring this home. Why in Queensland, well, first start, parents and citizens organisations for state schools are basically the same, they do the same things all around Australia. But why in Queensland are parents and citizens organisations in state schools regarded as tax exempt and will be filing with the ATO, whereas P&Cs in New South Wales will be regarded as charitable and are filing with the ACNC, and in Victoria are regarded as tax exempt and will be filing with the ATO. And in Tasmania, nobody can work out what P&Cs will be doing. Some will be filing with the ACNC and some will be filing with the ATO. Now, if that's not enough, the Queensland Law Society here is a tax-exempt body, but in Victoria, the Law Institute of Victoria is registered with the ACNC. Now, I can keep on going all day with such examples, but this Division 50 needs to be reformed, and that lies with the government. It's your job to do that. That's where you're failing.
Thanks very much for going over the background of the issue back to 2018 and the 2020 government response and the budget, and also for putting some broader issues on the agenda for the committee and for the shadow minister there as well. I'll go back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. The submission that was provided to the Australian Taxation Office of the 9th of April 2024, did the Queensland Law Society receive a response to that?
No, Chair, not that I'm aware of.
Thank you very much. Is it too late to create an alternative implementation pathway? This is the question to the law societies.
Chair, I would suspect no. If there's a determination coming out of the conversations with this committee that is the best way forward, I think in any number of contexts there are examples of policies being changed at relatively short notice, taking into account the experiences of those affected by the implementation.
Well, I'd just add to that less than 6% of the population NFPs have responded thus far. Ms. McDoodle, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, if there is an opportunity to abandon and reconsider with proper consultation on how it should most effectively be rolled out, bearing in mind, you know, the desire to reduce red tape wherever you can.
In the submissions, some comments are made in regards to the very brief or inadequate time, I think is the word used by the Queensland Law Society, around the consultation. So we have two things happening here. We have the ATO and others declaring that this is the most significant initiative in the not-for-profit sector since 2012, so over a decade. And then in your submission, you point to just 19 business days for consultation. Did that come as a surprise to you? Or were there alternative consultation mechanisms established after that March to April period?
Chair, I think we have to separate two issues here. There's the policy issue and then there's the process of implementation.
Correct.
The policy issue about whether we have the return is one issue. How you implement that is another issue.
Well, to be clear, the terms of reference, we're talking about the implementation here, but I'm happy to speak in the broad. Yep.
The Queensland Law Society's response to the ATO regulation was really in response to the policy about whether the regulation was appropriate. And that was the first moment that there was any consultation that I know of by the government on an official, usual basis, given that there was no regulatory impact statement or otherwise, that people could have a formal say. Now, it seems to me it's not up to in my view, it's not up to the ATO to sell, you know, why we have this for level playing fields or wanting to know who everybody was in the sector. It was at that point that the debate needed to occur.
So going back to an alternative implementation route, how long do you think it would, if government was to decide to pause the current process? It's already provided an extension to the compliance date, but if there was a decision to examine an alternative pathway for implementation, how long would that consultation deliberation have to take, do you think? Given that my assessment is that many of these issues are well known to the ATO, even if they haven't followed them through, but how long would an alternative implementation pathway take to establish?
Senator, that would depend on the amount of resources that the government puts at it. The ACNC is already rushed off its feet for a very small number of the not-for-profits out there that are affected. And as I said in my opening submission, there's up to 600,000 out there by the last reckoning. I don't think the ATO, the government, really realises the size of the problem and the extent to which it has caused confusion in the sector. And the problem here will be, I don't know how long's a piece of string. That's how many people is the government going to throw at this, at the ACNC and the tax office, who actually deal with all these inquiries, from people who are trying to plan and budget for next year for their funding, not knowing whether they're going to have the capacity to be tax exempt or not, whether they can become a charity or whether they shut their doors.
Ms McDougall, do you have a view about how long it might take to create an alternative implementation pathway?
I think it's really important to learn from what's happened, and that part of the issue, major issue, is getting hold of the right person in the community group, and doing it in a way that isn't frightening. And so I do think that a lot of time probably needs to be built in, perhaps longer than normal in relation to consultation, to ensure that one, we're actually getting hold of the right people, and two, that we're doing it in a way that is approachable and explainable and understandable, and not frightening. And probably, you know, given that it's already gone through a process, that hopefully you'd be saying, you know, if your annual revenue is less than 3 million, 5 million, whatever it is, or an amount that we're still trying to work out, you won't need to do anything.
Agreed. Okay. Senator Walsh, are you still with us, or? We have run over time, but can I thank you all very much for your very, very helpful submissions and the detail in which you provided in each of those submissions. If you have taken any questions or notice, we'd appreciate that they be provided to the committee by the close of business on the 25th of October, and we thank you very much for your participation this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we know if they have any? Sorry. Do we know if they have any opening statements? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Chair, if they do, they can always take. I now welcome the Australian Taxation Office, the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, and Mr Timothy Stokes. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. The Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground upon which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer, having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Commonwealth officers appearing today are also reminded of the Senate order specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised. A copy of that order is available from the Secretariat. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today, beginning with the Australian Taxation Office?
Thank you, Chair. So, Mr Will Day, Deputy Commissioner of Taxation for Small Business.
Thank you.
Assistant Commissioner Jennifer Moltisanti, Not-for-Profit and Government Experiences.
Thank you. And the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission?
Sue Woodward, Commissioner, Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission.
Thank you.
Rachel Smith, Acting Assistant Commissioner, Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission.
And Mr Stokes?
Yeah, Timothy Stokes. I'm a partner with HWL Ipsworth Lawyers. I practice in tax, charity and not-for-profit. I'm also the co-chair of the ATO's Not-for-Profit Stewardship Group, a role I co-chair that group with Mr Day.
Thank you very much. I now invite you to make a short opening statement if you desire, and at the conclusion of remarks I'll invite committee members to begin with questions. Does the Australian Taxation Office have an opening statement?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I don't have a formal opening statement, but I would like to make some opening remarks. So, Will Day, Deputy Commissioner of Taxation. The federal government announced as part of the 2021-22 budget that in effect all self-assessing income tax exempt not-for-profits with an active ABN would be required to submit online an annual self-review of eligibility from the 1st of July 2023 to ensure that only eligible not-for-profits are accessing income tax exemptions. Under the self-assessment system, many not-for-profits were self-assessing or perhaps had simply assumed they were exempt even though they may not have been eligible. Importantly, eligibility requirements for income tax exemption under the law hasn't changed, including the obligation to self-assess annually. Nevertheless, since the government announcement of the new reporting requirement, the ATO has undertaken extensive consultation, engagement and communication to raise awareness and to develop tailored support. We've undertaken research user testing and delivered over 60 presentations and counting at key sector events and conferences. We've taken careful attention to make the self-review returns streamlined and quick to submit. We've also developed numerous transitional support measures, including allowing lodgement of the 2024 year return up to the 31st of March 2025. To date, more than 11,000 not-for-profits have successfully lodged their return via online services or through the not-for-profit phone service. Nearly 3/4 of these lodgements were submitted by small not-for-profits. Together with ABN updates and an increase in not-for-profits with charitable purposes registering with the ACNC, it does demonstrate improved transparency and integrity of the income tax exemption as intended by the reform. We are applying a practical compliance approach to assist not-for-profits who mistakenly assumed an entitlement and incorrectly self-assessed as exempt, in some cases for many years. We also have a wealth of information, including public advice and guidance on our ATO website and a dedicated not-for-profit advice service available on 1300 130 248, which is available for not-for-profits that require further assistance. I'm proud of our efforts to date, and we continue to work closely with the ACNC and other stakeholders to support this vital community sector to help them to meet their obligations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Day. Could you make that opening statement available to the Committee Secretariat? And what was the figure that you used in terms of the compliance thus far?
As of today, more than 11,000 not-for-profits.
Thank you very much. Ms Woodward, do you have an opening statement?
No, Senator, I thought it best to allow the time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr Stokes?
I'm much the same. My opening statement would just reflect what's in my written submission, so I'm happy to answer questions. I will say, though, I think the fundamental point for me in this process is that this return doesn't, in my view, impose on these entities any new obligation apart from lodging the return itself. It merely just reflects what is the current legal position these entities are subject to, and so on that basis, I've always considered it reasonable.
Mr Stokes, I might just start with you then. When was the last meeting of the ATO Not-for-Profit Stewardship Group?
Sorry, if you just bear with me one moment. I believe it may have been in May.
Was it March 2024?
No, my apologies. It was 17 July of this year.
17 July of this year. And the one previous to that was?
We meet 3 times a year. The one previous to that would have been
March?
19 March of this year.
Great. Okay, and the record of the 17th of July meeting is not yet on the ATO website?
I might defer to Jennifer on that point. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Chair. I think the key messages are on our website, but...
No, the key messages from the March meeting were posted on the 4th of September, 6 months. My question is, the 17th of July meeting, have those key decisions or discussion points been posted on the ATO website yet?
I would have to check that, Chair.
Does it normally take 6 months for records of the meeting to...
We normally try and get them out as soon as practicable, but I would need to check that if I can take that on notice.
I'm happy to stand corrected, but the 19th of March meeting, the record or discussion points was published on the 4th of September.
Okay.
So if the record of the discussion points for the 17th of July are available, they should be posted as quickly as possible. Some questions to the ATO to start, and I'll share the call, of course, with Senator Walsh. Has the ATO provided a response to the correspondence that the Law Council of Australia sent to the Assistant Minister, Ms Dr Lee, and to the Assistant Treasurer, Mr Jones, on the 11th of July 2024?
Chair, I heard some of the earlier evidence that no response had been received. I'm not in a position to counteract that. I would have to take that on notice.
Yes, please. What is the total expected implementation cost of the initiative?
Chair, the ATO was given capital funding in the order of $1.9 million to build the online return process. The costs of administration, both for ourselves and Ms Woodward might want to speak to the ACNC, were borne in our existing funding.
Are you able to provide to the committee an estimate of what those the administration costs around the implementation are?
Chair, I would have to take that on notice.
That would be great. And could you provide for the committee details about what proportion of that total expenditure has actually been expended at this particular point?
Senator, the vast majority, certainly in terms of capital, has already been expended, but we can try to give an assessment of the ongoing administrative impact.
Yes, please. Has the government, in form of the responsible ministers, sought regular advice from the ATO in regards to the implementation?
Senator, we have been in contact through Treasury in particular as the government's representative over the course of the measure.
What has that discussion, contact, can you characterise that with a little bit more granularity for myself?
Chair, it's difficult to go into, of course, the advice given to government, but we've been given periodic updates on progress of implementation, the development of the return and so on.
Can you provide the committee to the dates on which those updates were provided from the ATO to the Treasury?
Chair, I'm aware that we've provided some material already to the committee, but yes, we'll certainly see whether there's anything additional we can provide.
Oh no, my question is the dates of the updates that the ATO has provided to the Treasury, and what has been the nature of those updates?
Certainly, Chair, and I will point out, of course, that Treasury is represented on our not-for-profit stewardship group, so they are regularly part of those meetings as well as other opportunities. But
they might be regularly part of those meetings, but those meetings don't happen regularly. There's a distinction.
The meetings happen regularly 3 times a year, Chair.
3 times a year.
Chair, if I might add, so we have the 3 published meetings per annum for our stewardship groups, but we also have occasion to call stewardship group members together for working party activities where there is an issue. Now, I would need to check my calendar with respect to when we have called stewardship group members or indeed other network stakeholders to have, a discussion with us with respect to the implementation of the new reporting requirements.
So there have been working party meetings or discussions?
I refer to them as working parties, but they're not like formal working parties. It may be a meeting to, for example, when we were looking at the design of the actual return, we worked with not only the stewardship group members, but the broader not-for-profit network to actually work through what the questions needed to look like, for example, and whether they were, in effect, something that they understood.
I'm interested to get a clear picture of the detail of the ATO's work around consultation with affected parties. So I'm keen to know dates of meetings just for this year, 2024, dates of meetings and names of participants. And the attachments that were provided or the tables that were provided in the ATO submission were not did not give me that level of clarity. What is the scope of the ATO's authority in being able to determine the implementation or policy guidelines around giving effect to that budget announcement. The submissions that were provided by the Queensland Law Society and the Law Council were quite prescriptive, and I think, from my perspective, quite reasonable in terms of what an alternative pathway for implementation might look like. For example, use of thresholds, etc., etc. What is the authority or the scope of the authority of the ATO to determine those sorts of things?
Chair, the key components, I guess, of the government's announcement as part of that 2021-22 budget, as I read it, was that the return would commence from the 1st of July 2023 for financial years, that it would apply in effect to all self-assessing not-for-profits who are, in terms of eligibility for income tax exemption, that it was an online return, and that it was an income tax return. Beyond that, of course, we have put in place a wide range of administrative concessions, which are outlined, of course, in our submission. In my opening remarks, I did mention that we have extended first lodgement to the 31st up to the 31st of March 2025. We have streamlined processes in terms of change of nominated contacts in entities through the ABN. We are putting in place a practical compliance approach in terms of focusing on future compliance for tax exemption for those who identify that they haven't been self-assessing in previous years correctly. And of course, taking a practical approach where entities are seeking registration with the ACNC in the meantime.
In some of the submissions, they point to the Australian Taxation Office submissions to the 2018 ACNC review. And if I understand that, a bit before my time, but if I understand that process correctly, the ATO did make a submission to the ACNC review about an alternative pathway for implementation, use of thresholds, etc. When the new government was elected, post-May 2022, did the ATO re-prosecute that view with ministers about the implementation arrangements for this initiative?
No, Chair.
Why not?
Because there had been a government decision subsequent.
The government changed.
Senator, the government decision at the time was that the response to that review was that, in particular, that recommendation 24, was that there would be an increased ATO supervision of that not-for-profit sector through the self-review return.
Has the government requested any advice on alternative pathways for implementation or alternative or possible reforms to give effect to this budget announcement?
That would be a matter of policy and a question I think would have to be directed to Treasury, Chair.
Perhaps you could take it on notice, or perhaps you could refer it to the Treasury.
It would be a matter that we would refer to Treasury.
So just to be clear, is this a revenue-raising initiative or is this a compliance initiative?
Chair, in terms of the budget announcement, the measure was estimated to have an unquantifiable impact on the underlying cash balance over the forward estimates period. It was a measure designed for transparency and integrity.
Unquantifiable because it was negligible or too hard to calculate?
Unknown.
Unknown. So it wasn't ever calculated?
Not to my knowledge, Senator, no.
So when some of the submissions talk about the regulatory burden compared to the mischief that this initiative might be seeking to ameliorate, when people talk about the disproportionate approach that the ATO might be taking in terms of implementation, how do you reconcile that with the indistinguishable revenue return?
Chair, as I indicated in my opening remarks, we did pay very careful attention to make the self-review return itself streamlined and quick to return. You'll note that as appended to our submission is a series of screenshots that...
I've seen all that, but Mr Day, the problem we have here is a complete misfit between what the not-for-profit sector is telling us around implementation, stress on volunteers, regulatory overreach, and what the ATO is doing. I don't doubt that the ATO is doing everything you say you are doing. What I'm saying is that there is a big gap between the experience of not-for-profits, right, and those people that are required to fill out the form, and what the ATO is doing. And after the evidence today and what we've heard previously, I'm genuinely concerned about whether the ATO has actually been listening. No, I'm sure you've been listening, but acting on the concerns that have been raised, not just by some of the groups that have been before us today, but the Law Council no less, the Queensland Law Society no less. So I'm interested in exploring why is there this incompleteness?
Chair, I would disagree that we haven't been listening.
No. People have said you've been listening. People have said you haven't acted on or incorporated their views. Now, you might have in terms of the simplification of the form, but more generally.
So certainly in terms of the administrative approaches, we have been listening and taking action. Through our stewardship group, we have consulted significantly on the form of the return itself, as well as the interactive voice recognition, the phone service version. It was before my time as responsible Deputy Commissioner, but we made very significant changes to the return on the basis of feedback we heard at the stewardship group. We have responded to feedback that it is difficult to update contact details, so we have provided a downloadable form, and we have provided specific instructions for not-for-profits that if they can append minutes from a committee meeting or AGM notifying of an update in contact details, we would accept that and update the contact details accordingly. We have responded in terms of some of what the not-for-profits are working through, and we've extended the due date until the 31st of March. We've certainly worked closely with the ACNC in terms of additional entities seeking charitable registration, and we've made sure that we are approaching that practically to make sure that we won't take enforcement action around the not-for-profit return whilst they're seeking charitable registration. Similarly, we've allowed those who are unsure if they've got charitable purposes to mark that on the return to complete the self-review return. And of course, we'll then work with that entity and the ACNC to determine the situation. So we've taken a lot of administrative steps in relation to the feedback that we've received.
I'll go to Senator Walsh before coming back to me, and I do have some questions for the ACNC.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think I'll just start with the ATO, and you've answered some of my questions because the Chair's asked you similar questions. So you've outlined that this was a budget initiative of the previous government in 2020-2021, that the purpose was a general integrity measure and that it was to come into effect in July 2023. So we're now in the implementation of this integrity measure. I hope this is not too much of a sort of a policy question for the ATO. I don't think it is, but at a general level, why is it important for there to be an uplift at some level in the integrity and oversight for this particular group of non-charitable not-for-profits which are claiming tax-exempt status.
Senator, just to correct you slightly, it was the 2021-22 budget that this was announced in, and obviously, we also have government's decision in relation to the ACNC review and recommendation 24, which was to increase the ATO's supervision. Obviously, I can't comment on policy per se, but I will say that from an administrator's perspective, we certainly are seeing numbers of not-for-profits coming forward as a result of our correspondence earlier this year to say that they have ceased operations, in fact ceased several years ago. So in terms of updating the quality of our register, that certainly helps us to understand who is out there. We've also, of course, had updates in terms of key contact officers and addresses for not-for-profits. As an administrator, that gives us a reliable contact list for educative purposes and a whole range of purposes. We've obviously heard that there are questions about the policy around Division 50. That's again not something that we can comment on whatsoever, but with entities querying whether they actually comply with the existing law, that obviously gives us, and that's the law that we have to administer, and that gives us the ability by carrying out these self-review returns of giving us a bit of a reset with the population and their obligations.
Yeah, thank you. And these self-review returns are due by the 31st of March, so there's an extended time period for people to be able to kind of get themselves around it. Is that right? And just within that, and you did address this with the chair, but what's the sort of couple of main things that you're finding are helpful to people as they navigate this new process?
Thank you, Senator. So yes, you are correct for this first year. We've certainly extended the due date to the 31st of March 2025. Of course, we will continue to work with any eligible or any relevant entities who have not lodged beyond that date to try to assist them to do so. I think you have heard in earlier evidence today that the lodgement of the second year's return should be even more straightforward, in that we will be able to pre-fill some of the answers based on previous lodgements. The process of current contacts authorising their replacements is certainly more streamlined under the Relationship Access Manager online process as well. I think having contact details up to date is probably one of the more significant things. I did mention a range of administrative concessions. One additional concession is for those entities who don't have a suitable constitution in terms of distribution of assets, provided they haven't distributed to their members, we will accept their lodgement and give them until, I'll ask Ms Moltisanti, but we've given extended time to get their constitutions updated.
So, Senator, with the not-for-profit self-review return, if a not-for-profit doesn't meet one of the 8 categories, and if they have charitable purposes, obviously they can look at registering with the ACNC, and then we will endorse them for income tax exemption. Alternatively, they are a taxable not-for-profit. So a not-for-profit that has charitable purposes can actually choose not to register with the ACNC, but they do become taxable. Now, as a result of the transparency and integrity that's starting to come through from a lodgement perspective, we are seeing a large number of not-for-profits that are actually taxable, and we're working with them. We've got some large cohorts of not-for-profits that are taxable, and there is a concession in the system that allows them to lodge a non-lodgement advice if their taxable income is less than $416 although we have heard feedback from the sector that that threshold is quite low, because we've worked out that it wouldn't take much to get beyond that threshold. But again, we are providing significant concessions with respect to lodgement of their tax returns, and we're also looking at sort of relieving them of any penalties and interest charges should they be applicable as well.
Okay. So one of the matters that was raised was the need for the person whose name's attached to the ABN to be sort of, located in high turnover sort of volunteer organisations, so that the Australian Business Register can be correct and up to date. What advice do you give to people who may be having trouble sort of tracking down their responsible person or dealing with that issue?
Senator, I did touch upon this earlier, and I'll allow Ms Moltisanti to give a bit further detail. But in short, we've put in place a streamlined process, a downloadable form, which is specific for not-for-profits. And that allows really the instructions that go along with that form allow the not-for-profit to append committee minutes to demonstrate who the current contact is. But I'll allow Ms Moltisanti to expand.
So, Senator, my staff in Parramatta and Sydney actually monitor the 1300 number, and so we do get a lot of not-for-profits that need to update details and have had difficulty, for example, in posting the form to us or allocating the right evidence that they need to attach to the form and send it into the ATO. So they can call us on that 1300 number, and my staff actually work them through getting their details updated, and so that's been quite successful. But ordinarily, a change of registration detail form would need to be posted to the individual. The individual would need to complete it, then post it back to the ATO with evidence. And as Deputy Commissioner Wilday mentioned, we have made it a unique process for not-for-profits whereby they can actually download that form, complete it, send it in to us, and we will update their details. So we are trying to make it really easy. And even where that's failing, we are putting things in place to provide that additional support to not-for-profits that need it.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just go to Mr Stokes briefly, then back to you, Chair. We heard some evidence from Mr Crosby of CCA earlier around sort of a level of frustration with the process and also sort of different comments he made about the consultation with the ATO. And I was wondering if you could speak to what the process of consultation was with the ATO and whether any sort of improvements were made from your perspective in the rollout as a result of the consultation.
Sure, and I suppose I didn't have the benefit of hearing exactly what Mr Crosby had said, but I do understand his perspective from having communicated with him on this prior. From my perspective, and I said in the submission, I believe for approximately the last 18 months across those 3 meetings a year, this has been an item that's been on the agenda of the Not-for-Profit Stewardship Group. Over time, it has evolved from probably looking at a much more detailed and extensive form that was more complicated, and through the views of the group, and there are lots of different people on the Not-for-Profit Stewardship Group. Mr Crosby, there are charity representatives, there are people like myself, professional advisors, and there are government representatives, and all of those views have fed into a number of workshops, which has led to, in what I would consider to be a relatively streamlined and simplified version of what we started with. Throughout that process, the ATO have been very keen to engage with the group, acknowledging that that group has a variety of different stakeholder views that come in. But I think the other aspect that we've been aware of too in consulting with the ATO through that group is the development of what I would call the support architecture around this measure. And so Bill and Jennifer and their team have consulted with the group about what level of support and what level of consultation they think, we think would be necessary to support this cohort through this change. And then they've acted on that. Something like a really good example of that for me is the implementation of this measure for smaller entities to be able to lodge the return by phone. That's a fairly unique way to engage with the ATO and lodge a compliance lodge a return. And I think it's designed really to support that cohort through this measure. So I hope that answers your question, Senator, but I'm happy to supplement that if you need.
No, that's great, Mr. Stokes. And just finally from me, for the ATO, and we may have been over this, but there's no additional information, I guess, that people sort of need to be. Well, I'll ask it a different way. So how does the information that is required for this return differ from, I guess, what people need to be across for their self-assessment guidelines that they're familiar with? Is there any difference?
Senator, the return, I should say, is designed to step not-for-profits through the requirements of Division 50. So there's, aside from contact details and, one question around relative size in terms of turnover, it's just stepping those entities through both the general and the specific requirements of each of the categories under Division 50. But I'll ask Ms Moltisanti if she has anything to add.
Senator, just to add to Will's response, the return actually asks a not-for-profit to report on information that they should have at hand and that they are required to self-assess the income tax exemption against. So, as Will said, there are 3 sections on the return. Your organisational details, all organisations should know that. Which category are you self-assessing as income tax exempt against? And your governing documents, your purpose, your activities should all speak to which category. And then the 3rd section is the declaration. So the return is not asking for any additional information that a not-for-profit that self-assesses as income tax exempt would not have at hand.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Senator, just one final point to add. We do have information on our website, which is pre-advice, I guess, for an entity before they fill out the form to help them to understand what they need in front of them in order to complete the return. Again, all of which is entirely consistent with their existing self-assessment obligations.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. To the Australian Taxation Office, in your opening statement you mentioned that 11,000 organisations had completed the required form. That's of a population of 155,000?
We expect something in the order of 155,000, that's right, Senator.
So the 31st of March is just 5 months away. What do you expect the total number of compliant organisations to be as at the 31st of March next year?
That's very difficult to estimate for a lot of reasons, including...
So it could be 11,000 still?
We are continuing to receive sort of more than 200 a day at current rates.
So what is that a month? So then you are able to calculate what you expect it to be on the 31st of March, roughly?
Chair, we can look at it on a straight line projection, obviously, on current return rates. We do expect, obviously, whilst we're encouraging entities to lodge as soon as they can, we do expect many will lodge closer to the due date of the 31st of March. We have plans for further social media advertising campaigns in the later this month and early next month. We'll continue to attend not-for-profit group sessions, and Ms Maltasanti is representing the ATO in some further sessions tomorrow in Adelaide. We'll continue to raise awareness and support. Of course, if entities haven't lodged by the 31st of March, we'll continue to work with them to help them to meet their obligations.
So I've just done a quick calculation, 200 applications, 30 days a month over the next 5 months, and that takes me to about 30,000. Add that to the 11,000 you currently have, that's 41,000 of the 155,000 population group. What happens if an organisation hasn't complied by the 31st of March?
Chair, we have still in our sort of practical compliance or educative phase, so we'll be looking to contact those not-for-profits and work with them to help them to lodge.
So no fine?
At this stage, no, we wouldn't be looking at fines at the 31st of March, but we...
So then there's no problem in extending the compliance date then?
We would encourage all entities to lodge as soon as possible, of course. One of the difficulties naturally is we'll be into the next financial year, and of course, as we've already heard, we can support entities in their second lodgement. But yes, we'll certainly be working after the 31st of March. I do not expect 100% lodgement by the 31st of March.
So organisations do not have to fear a fine from the Australian Taxation Office if they don't comply by the 31st of March?
No, but they can expect us to be working with them to help them meet their obligations.
So there would be no impediment for the Australian Taxation Office to recommend to government an extension of the 31st of March reporting date, just to take the pressure off not-for-profits and some of those community organisations that we've heard from today?
Senator, we'll continue obviously to monitor lodgements. The pressure would be to
well, I don't expect you'll get many over January though, because that will be disrupting people's summer holidays.
Well, Senator, we've got the due date of 31st of March. Obviously, that avoids summer holidays. But yes, what we would want to avoid for most entities is that they have a double-up kind of obligation. They haven't met their first year before the second year becomes due. But of course, we'll be working with entities to help them comply.
So you've not provided any advice to government on an extension of the 31st of March reporting date?
No, we have not.
Have you been asked for any?
I'm not aware that we have, no.
I just want to turn to the ACNC if I now... Commissioner, in your submission you do talk about... Oh, sorry, before I do, Ms Woodward, Mr Wall, Mr Day, sorry, you have... the Australian Taxation Office has provided some resourcing to the ACNC in terms of the 25 additional staff. Could you just separate that out of the administration capital costs information that you committed to give to me earlier in the hearing?
Certainly, Chair.
Thanks so much. Ms Woodward, in your submission you talked about the increased demand for charity registrations that the ACNC is now experiencing as a result of this. Have you been able to do any calculations on future demand that the ACNC might continue to experience?
Thank you, Senator. We do project that there'll be an increase in demand as we see some of the deadlines coming closer. So I think it is logical to think that when people are getting closer to March, and also as the awareness of this new reporting measure grows, that more people will then be thinking through the follow-up question of whether they should apply for charity status. It is difficult to be precise about that, but certainly the extra support we've had from the ATO around an additional 20 staff, we did allocate our own extra staffing to the matter as well. That will mean that we've had the lead time to make sure those staff are fully trained and that we have the best processes in place to deal with any increase in demand.
So just on that point, to be clear, your submission says 25 new staff. Mr Day, is that 20 or 25 staff funded for by the ATO? Or Ms Woodward, can you just...
I think I'd defer to Ms Woodward.
My understanding is it's 25 staff in total, 5 from we'd already within our existing ACNC resources, and an additional 20 with support from the Commissioner for Taxation.
Thank you. So, Ms Woodward, those 5 that are now allocated to this increased workload, where were they diverted from in the ACNC?
Some of those positions, to give you a detailed breakdown of the 5, I'd take that on notice. Essentially, we were already, doing what we could to prepare for this measure. Some of those recruitment processes have actually been done on a flexible basis so that the staff recruited could both deal with the advice contact centre that we have or be deployed in the registration team. So it's given us the ability to be, if you like, as nimble as possible, depending on where at any point in time we're getting the most demand.
How has the increased level of demand for charity registration extended the average time that an organisation might expect to get registration?
There were already some longer periods than we would want before a matter is allocated for consideration. That was possibly already in play, really, from some of the other measures that have come into operation regarding DGR registers going across the ATO and like. So there was already a delay in the allocation. I think by the implementation of the range of measures, so both policies, processes and staffing, we've now, as of today, we get a daily update. About 56% of the applications we're receiving, new registration applications we are receiving, are being allocated to an analyst within a month, which is a pleasing reduction. There's still some that are, between the month and 2 months, and at the moment all allocations are occurring within the 3-month period.
But that's allocations to an assessment officer.
That's correct.
And has there been an extension in the amount of time an assessment officer is taking to assess the registration? Because the additional resourcing has been, you see what I'm saying? Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. Thank you, Senator. I do not believe so. In fact, I think we've actually improved that turnaround time. We do have a service standard that once we get all the information we need, we make the assessment within 15 business days. Obviously, if organisations are slow at sending information in, that can delay, obviously, our decision making. But one thing that we have done is we've completely revamped our online registration form. And part of that very long-term project that has now come to fruition was about making sure that you couldn't really complete the form without uploading or completing all the relevant information that we would need. And that has already, it's still early days, but the data is showing us that we're needing to make fewer requests for additional information because that is coming in with the revised registration form. So I do hope that's one of the process reforms that mean that we're not, once we allocate it, it's a fairly quick turnaround time within that service standard. And I would say in response to this particular population, where we've been able to group the organisations, for example, given they've spoken today, the land care groups, or if it's community neighbourhood houses or men's sheds, or where they can be grouped because they'll have similar constitution and very similar purposes, and we've been able to work with the peak body, we can consider those and do them as a bulk application process. And some of those, I think, as I've mentioned in our submission, have been able to be turned around very quickly because they are fairly simple, uncomplicated applications.
Do you expect to have to make further resourcing requests of government, whether it be the Commissioner for Taxation or the government in order to meet the increased level of requests for registration?
That is actually, as my colleagues in the Tax Office have pointed out, very difficult to predict. I think human behaviour is that you leave anything to the deadline, so it is possible that it could be a very big spike in March. But again, by working with our colleagues at the Taxation Office, if we can reassure people that if they're in the queue, they're not going to be action taken against them, I think that goes some way to us being able to manage the spikes that will occur. But I do acknowledge it's, if you like, a watching brief.
When do you expect that spike to occur?
As I say, Senator, I think it's highly likely if you look at the patterns of when people do their reporting, both to the ACNC in terms of annual information statements, but possibly more broadly in the lead up to the 31st of March, in that month in particular, we would certainly be expecting a spike and we'll be planning for that accordingly.
How would you characterise the level of awareness of organisations in regards to the ATO changes?
We've certainly experienced people calling us, but mostly that's awareness has come, and I'll leave it to my ATO colleagues to comment more specifically, but usually we've been able to see that where a letter has gone from the ATO to groups, there's been a mail out, we'll see a corresponding increase in the inquiries, which is the right process in the sense that if people have got the letter and they've understood that they might need to consider charity registration, then we'll see some spike in the calls that we might get, for example, to our contact centre or in the number of applications we get. And I think at the moment I've been really pleased with the process in the sense that we've often had phone calls, we've realised, oh, this is a whole cohort, it might be community gardens or something. We've been able to then contact the peak body, reach out to them as the ACNC, talk them through how we could work with them in a bulk application process and support them in that way.
Based on the questions to the ATO, based on my calculations, there could be over 100,000 organisations that haven't complied by the 31st of March. Are you working to a benchmark, a success or KPI in regards to the number of organisations you expect to comply by the 31st of March?
Chair, a couple of points. Firstly, just to confirm Ms Woodward's evidence that, yes, if there are entities in the queue for charitable registration, of course, we will be pausing any further action on those, and we are working, as she has indicated, very closely together. In terms of market penetration or awareness, we do have specific web pages on the ATO website, and we know that we've had something like 77,000 hits in terms of how to prepare the not-for-profit self-review return, and over 70,000 hits in terms of how to notify changes to your not-for-profit. So we do know that there's a great degree of awareness already. I have mentioned we'll continue our awareness campaigns, including specific advertising. In terms of a particular KPI, no, I think I mentioned earlier that we don't expect 100% lodgement by the 31st of March, but we'll continue to work with all those entities that haven't.
But you must be working to some measure of success, 80%, 85%. I'd be very surprised.
I don't have a specific measure.
But there is a specific measure? You just don't have it in front of you?
No, we have not set a specific measure. We're monitoring lodgements closely and we'll be following up with all those who haven't lodged. But no, we don't have a specific measure by the 31st of March.
If you could just, on notice, just reconfirm that to the committee in writing, that would be most appreciative. Just finally, you've been very generous with your time and we have run over time. Ms Woodward, in your submission you make the statement that if projections about the number of not-for-profits that will need to register with the ACNC are correct, we may see up to a 25% increase in the number of registered charities. So that's a total of 60,000 to over 75,000. In what time span were you making that prediction or that calculation?
It is of its very nature. I'm sure you accept we have to make a rough estimate. So we went with sort of 10% of the total population. And over the period of time, again, it's hard to know, and it may not be as much as that. So we tried to say up to that amount. We've already, keep a tab on the number of registered charities that I'm responsible for. So it's gone from 60,000 approximately to about 61,000 approximately. And from what we can tell, probably about 700 of the 1,000 are already related to this measure. So that gives us some indication, but it is still very early days because initially we weren't able to specifically identify who was coming to us because of this measure, if you like. So it's something that we're watching.
And then finally, Ms Woodward, in the submissions which you may have seen and in some of the evidence, there has been a discussion around the ACNC 2018 review, and in that review various recommendations were made about the sort of role that the ACNC could have in this particular matter. Do you have any observations about the ACNC's willingness or capacity to accept some of those ideas that were part of that 2018 review?
I guess all I can really say on that, Senator, is that I can't but acknowledge the word not-for-profits is in our name. So there was some, obviously, consideration at the time of our formation that there would be some role, but without legislative change and resourcing, it would be for the government to work out what if any, of that role is ultimately or was adopted.
Okay, and I promised the very, very last question, but given your extensive involvement, association with this sector generally, do you have any insights into why the government at the time did not accept that recommendation 24 of the ACNC review?
As you say, Senator, I was not in my current role at that time.
Not in your current role, but...
No.
But familiar with issues? I
was very familiar with those issues, and I know that as the sector was waiting for quite a considerable period of time for a response to that review, and I don't have any particular insight to add as to why the government at the time did not accept that recommendation.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you very much for your participation today. I was going to make one final comment, but I'll save that for the ATO at estimates. Thank you very much for your participation today. It is greatly appreciated. If you have taken questions on notice, we would appreciate those being provided to the Committee Secretariat by Friday the 25th of October. I thank all the submitters. I hope that the ATO might look with fresh eyes on some of those ideas that have been presented through this process. And just for clarity, very interested in exploring alternative pathways that might meet the intent of the budget decision, but in a way that doesn't put unnecessary stress, frustration, concern, not my word, but it has been used, fear, into those community organisations across our country that are doing their best in very challenging circumstances. But I'll just leave it at that. So we thank you very much for your evidence and your cooperation today, and I'll close this public hearing. Thank you all very much.